Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea. If each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from, also give a like. And subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. When I first came to the cabin by the river, it felt like the perfect escape. I needed quiet, and this place had nothing but that. It was tucked away at the edge of a forest, with a long, winding river cutting through the trees. The water looked calm, almost peaceful, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves or the occasional call of a bird. I told myself this was exactly what I needed: a place to think, a place to write, a place to get away from the noise of the city and, well, the guilt I'd been carrying. My name's Harold. I'm a writer, or at least I try to be. Lately, the words just wouldn't come, so I rented this cabin for a few weeks, hoping a change of scenery might help. The locals were friendly enough when I arrived. They helped me with directions and pointed out where to buy supplies. But as soon as I mentioned the cabin by the river, their faces changed. An old man at the gas station leaned over the counter and whispered, "Keep your curtains closed at night." A woman bagging my groceries shook her head and said, "The river has secrets, mister. Be careful what you stir up." I laughed it off, thinking they were just trying to scare the city guy. But now, looking back, maybe they weren't joking. The first few days at the cabin were quiet. Too quiet, actually. I'd wake up early, sit on the porch with my coffee, and stare out at the river. The water had this strange way of catching the light. It shimmered, like glass, but there was something darker below the surface. Sometimes I thought I saw ripples, even though nothing seemed to move. I tried to write, but every time I sat down, my thoughts wandered back to the river. There was something about it that made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. One morning, as the sun rose, I saw something that stopped me cold. There was a figure-8 woman floating in the river. Her dress trailed behind her like a veil of mist, and her hair spread out in dark strands over the water. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a log or some debris. But then she turned her head, just a little, enough for me to see her face, or at least what should have been her face. But there was nothing there. I blinked, and she was gone. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it for the first time. A soft, dripping sound, like wet footsteps on the porch. And then, faintly, the sound of someone crying. The next morning, I woke up feeling strange. My body was stiff, like I hadn't moved all night, and my head throbbed as if I hadn't slept at all. I brushed it off and told myself it was just the unfamiliar bed. But deep down, I couldn't shake the memory of what I thought I heard outside those dripping footsteps and the soft crying. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, breathing in the cool morning air. The river looked as calm as ever, like nothing had happened. Maybe I was imagining things. Long days alone in the woods can mess with your head. But as I stood there, staring at the water, I felt something watching me. It wasn't a noise or a shadow, just a feeling, prickling at the back of my neck. That's when I saw her again. She wasn't floating this time. She was standing in the river, half submerged. The water came up to her waist, her dress swirling around her like smoke. Her back was to me, her long hair dripping black water down her shoulders. I froze. My coffee cup nearly slipped from my hand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't move. "Are you okay?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. I don't know why I didn't go down to the riverbank. Maybe it was the way she just stood there, completely still, as if she hadn't heard me. Or maybe it was because I was scared, more scared than I'd ever admit to anyone. I blinked, and she was gone. Just like before, she vanished in an instant, like she'd never been there at all. The water rippled where she'd stood, but there was no sign of her. No footprints in the mud. Nothing. I sat back down on the porch, my hands shaking as I clutched the mug. You're imagining things, I muttered to myself, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. That afternoon, I decided to head into town. I needed to see people, talk to someone, and convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. At the diner, I struck up a conversation with a man who looked like he'd lived there all his life. "Hey, have you ever seen anything strange by the river?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man stiffened. He set down his coffee and looked me straight in the eye. "You saw her, didn't you?" My stomach twisted. "Who?" "The woman in the river," he said, his voice low. "They say she only shows herself to those who have secrets, things they're hiding." I laughed nervously, but it didn't feel funny. "That's just some old ghost story, right?" The man leaned closer. "You can call it whatever you want, but if she's shown herself to you, it means something. You'd better be careful. If you don't face what you're hiding, she'll take you." I left the diner soon after, but his words stayed with me. I tried to convince myself it was just small-town superstition, a campfire story to scare people like me. But when I got back to the cabin, the river seemed different. The water was darker, almost black, and it didn't shimmer like before. It felt heavy, like it was pulling everything into it. That night, the crying started again. It wasn't faint this time. It was louder, clearer, like it was coming from just outside my door. And then I heard the dripping footsteps. Closer and closer. I sat frozen on the bed, clutching the sheets, my breath stuck in my throat. When the footsteps stopped, I didn't dare move. The only sound left was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning I felt like I hadn't slept in years. My body was heavy, and my mind was racing with everything that had happened. I tried to convince myself again that it was all in my head stress, maybe, or the isolation messing with me. But deep down I knew it wasn't. I avoided looking at the river that day. It was strange I'd come here to write, but now the only thing I wanted to do was stay away from that water. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the blank screen for hours. Nothing came to me. The only thing I could think about was the woman and the man's words at the diner. "If you don't face what you're hiding, she'll take you." What was I hiding? I didn't want to think about it, but I knew. The accident. It happened years ago, but I remembered every detail like it was yesterday. A rainy night, a dark road, the sickening sound of the impact. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I shook my head, trying to push the memory away, but it clung to me like the river mist. That evening, the sun set early, and the cabin grew cold. I lit a fire in the small stone fireplace and tried to focus on anything but the creeping dread in my chest. But as the hours passed, the air seemed to grow heavier. And then I heard it. Drip, drip, drip. The sound came from the porch, steady and rhythmic, like water dripping off a soaked coat. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to look. I wanted to stay where I was, pretend I couldn't hear it. But my body moved on its own. Slowly, I walked to the front door, my feet dragging with every step. I stopped just before the window and peeked out through the curtains. The porch was empty. I let out a shaky breath, but the relief didn't last. The dripping sound wasn't coming from the porch anymore. It was inside. I spun around, my eyes darting across the cabin. The sound was louder now, coming from the hallway that led to the bedroom. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper. No answer. I took a step forward, and the floor creaked beneath me. The fire in the fireplace flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. The air smelled damp, like wet earth and decaying leaves. As I reached the hallway, I saw it. A trail of wet footprints, leading from the door to my bedroom. I froze. My hands shook, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The footprints were small, like a woman's, and water pooled around each step. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. Still no answer. I wanted to turn around, run out of the cabin, and never come back. But something made me keep going. Step by step, I followed the trail until I stood outside the bedroom door. The crying started again. Soft, muffled, but so close now that I could feel it in my chest. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. The metal was ice cold, and when I turned it, the door creaked open. The room was empty. The footprints stopped at the middle of the floor, and water dripped steadily onto the wooden planks. And then I saw her reflection. In the small mirror above the dresser, the woman stood behind me, her head tilted to the side. Her dress clung to her body, soaked and torn, and her hair dripped black water onto the floor. I couldn't see her face, it was blurred, like the surface of a rippling pond. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, it was cracked, a jagged line cutting through the glass. The reflection of the room behind me was empty. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, and didn't leave the living room for the rest of the night. I kept the fire going until the sun rose, afraid to let the dark settle in. By morning, I made up my mind. I had to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't just in my head. It was real, and I couldn't stay here any longer. But something told me it wasn't going to let me go that easily. The decision to leave should have brought me some relief, but it didn't. I packed my bag quickly that morning, stuffing my laptop and clothes into it without much thought. All I wanted was to get away from the cabin and that river. But as I stepped outside to load my car, I froze. The river was different. The water wasn't calm anymore. It churned and swirled, dark and restless, as if it was alive. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and the trees around the cabin seemed taller, their branches twisting toward the sky. I took a shaky breath, threw my bag in the car, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. No, 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 I muttered, trying again. The car wouldn't start. A faint sound reached my ears. At first I thought it was the wind, but as it grew louder I recognized it. Crying. I turned toward the river. She was there. This time, she wasn't in the water. She stood on the riverbank, her head tilted slightly, her long hair hanging wet and heavy down her shoulders. Her dress clung to her body, dripping water onto the ground. And her face, it wasn't blurred anymore. Her eyes were empty sockets, black and hollow, and her mouth was stretched wide, impossibly wide, into a dark, gaping hole. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. "You need to leave," I whispered to myself. But I didn't. I couldn't. She raised her arms slowly, pointing at me with a waterlogged hand. Her fingers were long and thin, her nails broken and jagged. "You," she whispered, her voice low and cold, like the rush of the river. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" Her mouth moved, but the words didn't come from her lips. They echoed in my head, clear and sharp. Confess or drown. The memory of the accident hit me like a punch to the gut. The rainy road, the figure stepping into my path, the way I kept driving, too scared to stop. "No," I said, shaking my head. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." But the words felt hollow, even to me. "Confess," she said again, her voice rising. The river behind her surged, the water crashing violently against the rocks. Tears filled my eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was scared. I didn't stop because My voice broke. "I didn't stop because I was a coward." She stepped closer, her feet silent on the wet ground. The crying grew louder, echoing all around me. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment everything was still. The river calmed, the air softened, and her figure seemed to blur, like she was fading away. But then her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and her voice came again, softer this time. Too late. The last thing I felt was her hand on my arm, cold and wet, pulling me toward the river. The next day, a fisherman found my body floating in the river. My face was frozen in a look of pure terror, and my lips were slightly parted, as if I'd been trying to say something. The locals shook their heads when they heard the news. "Another one," they whispered. "Another secret dragged to the surface." And as the fisherman packed up his things, he glanced back at the river one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw a woman standing in the water, her dress trailing behind her like mist. But when he blinked, she was gone. They say the river doesn't let go. After my body was found, the locals talked in hushed tones, like they always do when the river takes someone. The fishermen kept their boats closer to shore, and the kids stayed away from the water's edge. But no one was really surprised. She came for him, one of the old men said at the diner. Must have been hiding something. The river knows. The cabin was abandoned again. No one wanted to rent it after what happened. But every now and then, someone still claims to see Hertha woman in the river. They say she appears just before dawn, standing in the water with her dress drifting like smoke. If you listen closely, you can hear her crying. People don't talk about it much, but the ones who've seen her know the truth. She's not just a ghost or some old story. She's something else. And if you see her, you'd better listen. Because the river always gets what it's owed. The cabin by the river sat empty for a long time after they found me. People in town didn't want to go near it, not even to collect the rent that was still owed. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was the river's doing. Whatever the reason, it stood there, quiet and still, like it was waiting for someone else to come along. The fisherman who found my body couldn't shake the image of my face. He told his wife he was done with the river, sold his boat, moved his family to the next town over. But late at night, when he closed his eyes, he swore he could hear crying outside his window. One day, a group of hikers passed by the cabin on their way through the woods. They stopped to rest, sitting by the river's edge. It was a clear, sunny day, and the water looked calm, almost inviting, until one of them noticed something. "What's that?" a young woman asked, pointing toward the middle of the river. The others turned to look. For a second, there was nothing, just the glint of sunlight on the water. But then they saw it too, a figure, barely visible, standing in the shallows. "It's probably just a shadow," one of the men said, though his voice wavered. The figure moved, slowly, deliberately. The hikers froze, their laughter and chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. The woman in the river tilted her head, as if she was listening. "Let's go," the young woman whispered, grabbing her bag. But as they scrambled up the path, one of the men hesitated. His face went pale, and he stared at the river, his mouth slightly open. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" "She said something," he muttered, stepping closer to the edge. The others pulled him back, dragging him away from the water. They didn't wait to find out what would have happened if he stayed. By the time they made it back to town, none of them could explain what they'd seen. They told their story to a few locals, who only nodded knowingly. "She shows herself to the ones who need to see her," an old woman said, shaking her head. "They're lucky they left when they did." The hikers didn't stick around much longer. They didn't want to know more, didn't want to understand what they'd seen. And the woman in the river waited, her reflection rippling under the surface, patient as always. Because secrets have a way of coming back, no matter how deeply they're buried. And the river never forgets. What you've heard so far is nothing compared to the horrors in our next story. I know what you're thinking. That kind of warning is probably meant to sell seats. Charge extra for ghost tours. That's what my boss told me to do when we first started having this problem. Things escalated quickly from just the occasional complaint after about 3 weeks. That was when someone claimed the person they came to the movies with had simply disappeared. We chalked it up to just a few moviegoers wanting to pull a prank, or maybe couples having problems and leaving their exes high and dry during a bad cinematic experience. I guess I didn't really think it was real until we found the blood dripping from a theater seat last week. It looked like someone had been sitting there enjoying their popcorn one minute, and the next had been brutally chewed up like jerky. It was just after a matinee show. My best friend Wade was on cleanup duty and shouted loud enough for me to hear in the women's stall next door. I ran in there, thinking maybe he had found another homeless person passed out, and instead discovered what looked like a putrid pile of guts and loose hair and bone. Wade and I both did our best to hold back the nausea we felt, and I told him that I would call the shift manager Joey so we could figure out what to do about this. Joey was not as easily upset about the situation as us because he was convinced it was just some crazy prank. There's no way anyone could have been murdered in here. It was during a normal viewing, right? So that means there must have been at least 50 people in the audience. Look at where this happened. Most of them would be in rows above the mess. So how could that have occurred when there were so many eyewitnesses? He told Wade and I to stop being babies and clean it up, or he would tell the theater owner. When he left, my friend and I were still uneasy about the grotesque scene. But part of what Joey said made sense. I've worked in haunted houses before. The stuff they do to the models in there is pretty convincing, I told Wade as I grabbed some gloves and pushed my cart next to his. I also knew that Joey expected us to move fast. The next movie would be premiering in 15 minutes. So despite how awful it made us feel or how eerie the entire cinema felt, we had to get the job done. We didn't talk during the cleanup, just grabbed the loose organs and tossed them into bags like they were Coke cans. I convinced myself it had to be just par for the course like Joey said, and I put it out of my mind when it was all said and done. Then it happened again. And this time a moviegoer claimed they heard strange noises in the theater right before we went in for cleanup. I think there is one guy still in there, watching the end credits, they told me. Both of us talked about the noises that others had claimed to have heard as we entered the vacant cinema. On the screen, we saw that the final credits had played, and that typically meant the lights would go up inside the room. But this time, they went out entirely. Wade froze as we got to the steps, and he remarked, "Austin, I swear I saw something move on row K." I took out my flashlight, feeling my heart beat a little faster as I told him to calm down. I focused the beam of light on the row he mentioned. Not seeing a thing. "Your eyes are playing tricks with you. Go get the lighting working and I'll start at the top," I told him. Wade left and I slowly walked up the theater steps. I've worked here for a few years and was used to being in these cinemas alone. But this time felt very different, especially because of the total darkness. I was about midway up the steps when I heard the strangest noise. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A baby crying. The rumors were real. I stopped where I was and kept the flashlight close to me, trying to not freak out. "Wade, that better not be you trying to scare me," I shouted toward the noise. It was distant, somewhere on the other side of the auditorium. But as I stood there and moved the flashlight across the empty seats, I noticed the crying became more incessant. Then I saw a silhouette of someone sitting near the middle of the cinema, row M, and it nearly made my heart skip a beat. They were sitting very still, almost motionless in the recliner like they had fallen asleep. Except I saw there was something else there, hunched on top of the stranger's shoulders, with its head twisted down, and its mouth right against a cavity in the man's head. As I let the flashlight linger over top of the slumped shoulders of the moviegoer, I saw the creature was no longer than a small child. Its legs bent backwards and its toes digging into the theater seat, as it passively ate the man's innards from his skull like they were soup. It had no hair or skin color, just a long, bony body, and misshapen head resembling that of a goblin shark. I heard it make short work of the victim, tearing him apart with no regard for the mess as it snarled and then turned its putrid gaze to me. It shrieked, angered by the light, and I swear to you it sounded like the squeal of a newborn. I dropped the light in an instant and it ran off into the shadows, leaving behind the husk of the unfortunate man, still covered in blood and drool like a discarded piñata. Wade returned moments later as the electrical problems were fixed and saw me standing there, stiff as a statue staring at the body, too mortified by the last few minutes to move or speak. I didn't have to, though. The gruesome carnage spoke for itself. So we closed off that cinema and called the police right away. Joey insisted I avoid mentioning anything about a feral beast child running amok, so the cops only thought they had a homicide to investigate. "What's the plan to catch this thing?" "If we don't do something, more bodies will start piling up and we'll be out of business," Joey asked. I didn't even want to fathom being near it again. You didn't see what I saw. It broke that man's neck like it was nothing, and moved faster than lightning. The fucking thing was a demon. Maybe so, Joey conceded as he stared down at the roped-off cinema. But it still must be mortal. Those cops found traces of skin and saliva that didn't belong to the victim. That must mean this beastie boy is living within the walls of this theater somewhere. Great. Guess that explains the crying we've been hearing these past few weeks. It must be getting hungrier. Must be why it's resorting to these vicious killings. Joey had a glint in his eye. An idea had formed of what we would do next. If it's taking bigger risks, then that means we need to do the same and starve it. We'll close the entire theater for a week, and then lure it into a cinema and catch it. It will be so blinded by hunger that it won't see the trap, Joey decided. To do something like that, we would need to find live bait. The creature has been attacking lone moviegoers near the end of the films. Stands to reason, even in desperation, it would match that pattern, Wade suggested, as he returned from finishing his statement with the police. Sounds like you would be just the man for the job, our boss said, patting Wade on the back. Once we catch it, what are you planning to do with it? I asked, not even daring to think of the bizarre plan for the trap he had in mind. Wade's life was at risk, or worse, it could be that none of this went as planned and the feral child left the theater without a second thought. Joey smiled, promising us glory and fame if we did as he said. It was an alluring prospect. To catch something like this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Somehow he persuaded us. Or maybe deep down we wanted it and thought we had a shot at getting that limelight. Either way, Joey called the theater owner to explain the need for shutting down the entire building for a week, just to get rid of the bad stench from the dead body. Not wanting any more bad press, they agreed to it, and we prepared for the next encounter with the feral child. The week honestly went by too quickly for me. Every day Joey would gather supplies or call me to make sure I wasn't backing out. And I know what you were thinking because I thought about it too. Why was I not backing out? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that crazy feral beast crawling over that poor man's body like praying mantis. I knew it could easily kill us the moment we were alone with it again. And after a week of no food, it would be even more deadly. But Wade didn't want to back down. He was stoked to meet this monster and was convinced Joey's plan was going to work. We've got automatic weapons, a cage strong enough to hold a lion, and if things go wrong, we've got you to come in with the grenade and save the day. I didn't like the idea of being the one to hold such a dangerous explosive, but my friends were not going to be talked out of this crazy plan. So I just nodded and listened, the panic and dread growing in me with each passing moment. You ever see a car crash? It all happens so fast, and yet, as you replay it in your head, you see every little detail. This was the same way. I knew where this was heading, and there was nothing that could stop it either. When the time came, I was told to be up in the film booth to work the projector. We would play a short film and pretend that work was returning to normal. When we walked into the cinema, though, I immediately felt uneasy. I was expecting more destruction, because if the child was cornered and searching for food, surely it would have turned over every nook and cranny to find some. So why was the building seemingly untouched? Had it moved to greener pastures in the week we were gone? It's still here, I'm sure of it, Joey said as he got Wade in place near the middle of the cinema, and then gave me the hand signal to start the film. The movie played and I watched as intently as I could. I was supposed to give a warning the moment something went wrong. As I sat there in the small reel studio, I couldn't help but think this was my passion as well. I was vulnerable because I was so focused on wanting this I didn't consider that I could be a target. Then a small droplet of spit fell onto my shoulder. I dared to look up, my knees buckling as I saw two wide-slit eyes, filled with pure hate, staring down at me. It had the face of a woman, ragged jet-black hair with pale skin and parched lips. From the neck down, though, all I saw was a monstrosity, with enough legs, arms, and sagging tits to resemble a human centipede. The creature slowly crawled from the ceiling to the ground in front of the projector. It stood to its full height, hunching over in the tall room to make it clear how large it was. With its back legs cracking and bending in impossible directions, it crushed the projector and moved toward me, pinning me into a corner before I even had a chance to react. I closed my mouth, trying hard to not scream while the creature opened its own, and a forked, barbed tongue slowly edged its way out and moved along my cheek. The prickly texture ripped at my skin, the way a razor might cut you for an early morning shave. This beast was preparing to kill and eat me, but first it wanted to play with me first. I closed my eyes, the spit from its mouth oozing against my scalp as I shook and whimpered. From behind, I heard a voice. Joey. He was standing there at the back entrance to the projector room, and he had something next to him. It took a moment in the new darkness of the theater to see it clearly. Wade's crazy plan had worked. The smaller, hunched baby was in Joey's arms, screaming for its mother. Suddenly, eating me was forgotten, and the centipede woman rushed toward Joey like a freight train. Joey slammed the door shut, and I heard the wails of the smaller beast echo loudly as he ran to the open theater. The mother gave a banshee cry in response, moving to the window where the projector had once emitted its pictures onto the big screen. It began to hit the glass, frantic to reach its young. I slumped down to my hands and knees, crawling over to the other exit while it was distracted. I didn't even dare to look back as I made it into the fire stairs. Then I started to look for a weapon that could potentially finish the monster off. Joey and Wade were waiting in the cinema, as I rushed in, both of them watching frantically for the mother to break through, and Joey told us both to remain perfectly still. The trap would work, he promised. He was sure of it. We stood perfectly still and looked toward the window, sure the mother would burst through a few more seconds. But the cinema was deathly silent, and I noticed even the young infant creature was quiet. Something was wrong. A strange clattering noise resounded, and Joey looked about frantically, trying to determine where it came from. It's using the floor vents to move around, I realized as I heard the noise echo near us. There was no way to be sure where it might strike. Joey took a step back, looking toward the vent nearest to us. Then all of us watched in amazement as the centipede woman pushed the grating up and lunged. It struck Joey first, allowing the child to worm free as its barbed tongue jabbed his right eye. I pulled Wade from where he stood and demanded he give me the weapon he was supposed to have brought. He passed me the small fire axe, and I swung at the back of the woman, trying to fend her off before she killed Joey. The younger creature shrieked and bounded toward me when it heard its mother in pain. With the axe as my only defense, I swung at the young beast and lopped its head off with one swift stroke. This sent the mother into a frenzy. She tossed Joey across the room like he was a rag doll, and then flung chairs toward my head. The blind rage was the only thing saving me from being killed, and I used it to run and hide. For some reason, I thought Wade would be smart enough to follow me. Instead, when I looked back, I saw he had found one of the chairs that the mother had ripped from our cinema and hurled it back at her. All that did was enrage her even more. Its serpentine body wrapped around Wade, and I heard his bones break as the monster constricted his life away. Long ivory fangs extended from the woman's mouth, and her jaw collapsed down to allow her to bite on his head as his eyes widened with absolute fear. All I could do was watch as the snake woman enclosed her throat over my friend. Somehow I snapped out of the sheer terror, and before I knew it, I was at her back with the axe again. I slammed it into her jagged spine 12 times. The creature moaned and shook, refusing to release Wade. So I did what I knew my friend would have wanted, and instead ended his life right where the snake's head was at. Her grip tightened and her body reeled back as she took Wade's head right where I had severed it. His spine scattered across the cinema with muscle and sinew raining down. Then the beast recoiled and crawled toward another vent. Somehow I knew if it escaped that it would return, but I was so transfixed on the broken body of my friend I could not stop him. The centipede lady pushed her body into a vent, and then was out of sight, before I could even try to get a few more good hits in. I kept looking at where Wade's neck, now bled out on the brown carpet, disturbed not only because of what I had been forced to do, but also by what was lodged there amid his tissue and organs. They looked like millions of tiny bugs or tadpoles, if I'm being more precise, eating away at his corpse like it was a fresh kill. Something told me those bugs were more than just an afterthought. The serpent had attempted to implant Wade's corpse with a new batch of infant creatures. I shuddered and swung the axe against the body several more times, just to be sure her infectious young had nothing to feed on anymore. I went to find Joey next. He was hardly breathing, laying my next to a pile of debris and offering me a camera. "All the proof we need in there. Call someone," he begged. I told him the only ones I would call were 911, but he insisted we couldn't do that. The cinema would be closed down. I didn't care. Once he passed out, I made the call and then pulled him out of the cinema. He was unconscious when paramedics arrived, and my theater manager was there as well, demanding answers for all of the damage. I considered offering the camera as proof, but thought twice. Would he attempt to pursue this monster like Joey had? No more people could die. My reluctance to answer, however, was seen as negligence, and I was fired. I took that as the chance to tell the truth about the monster and what it had done. "It's all here," I insisted, prepared to give over the footage. He swatted it out of my hand and then smashed it to bits. "Utter nonsense. You best be glad that the police left, or I would be having you locked up as well." I looked at the destroyed footage. My hopes of Wade and Joey's sacrifice not being in vain were gone in mere seconds. I walked out, fists trembling. That was a few weeks ago. I have tried forgetting the whole ordeal, but circumstances don't let me forget. The manager closed the theater due to the overwhelming debt from the repairs. They demolished it a week ago, and there were no signs of the centipede woman except strange shreds of skin found in some of the old vents. I knew that meant she had shed her husk and healed, moving to a new feeding ground. This is why I now hear its clattering in the night or hear its wails in my restless sleep. I know it will search for me and find me for all that I did to it. Maybe I deserve it for even surviving. The whole experience has taught me I know nothing of our natural world, and that there are darknesses best left unexplored. I pass that knowledge on to others now who spread rumors of their own, be they a serpent or a rat or something else. I remind them that sometimes when you whisper about what lurks in the shadows, sometimes something whispers back. If you think the terror ends here, brace yourself for the darkness that follows. People called me a genius. The media said I was brilliant, a pioneer, a titan, or the industry. I graced the covers of magazines with headlines that screamed, "Visionary CEO disrupts tech world," or "The mind of a modern genius." The cameras loved me, and the world drank up every polished word I delivered in interviews. My life was bulletproof, my empire sprawling. It was easy to hide. Suits tailored to perfection, grins sharpened to charm boardrooms and TED Talk audiences, a steady hand when I held a microphone. But something about the applause always rang hollow in my ears, as though the sound was coming from somewhere far away. The first crack in the facade appeared with Vivian, my wife. For 10 years, she'd been the constant amid chaos. Viv was the calm in every hurricane, her laughter a balm, her gaze steady even when I fell into my darker moods. We'd met in college, a spilled coffee turning into love. She didn't marry me for success or wealth. She loved me, the version of myself I barely recognized anymore. Or at least, she had. I noticed it on a Tuesday, a day so inconsequential it should have evaporated from my memory like smoke. She was slicing lemons in the kitchen, the knife moving rhythmically. I walked in, still clutching my briefcase, and froze. Her hands weren't right. Vivian had delicate hands, hands that curved when she rested them on her cheek, hands that wrote letters in soft, sloping script. But these Hansher hands were slightly different. The fingers seemed longer, the skin paler, like they belonged to a wax model of her. She looked up at me and smiled. "Rough day?" she asked, as though nothing was wrong. It was her voice, her face, her everything. But my gut turned. My mouth went dry. "Yeah," I said after a pause, setting my briefcase down carefully. I forced myself to meet her eyes. Light hazel, same as always. But there was something behind them, something too smooth and placid, like the glass surface of a pond hiding something dark and writhing beneath. "You look pale," she said, stepping toward me. Her voice was honeyed, comforting, luring. I flinched before I could stop myself. "I'm fine," I said quickly. Her smile lingered for just a moment too long before she turned back to the lemons, the knife continuing its steady rhythm. The scrape of metal on wood drilled into my skull like a heartbeat. I chalked it up to exhaustion. That was logical, explainable. I was in the middle of developing the most ambitious AI platform of my career, one that had the board foaming at the mouth. 36-hour workdays were my norm. Sleep was a luxury, and sanity was a flexible concept. But after that night, I couldn't stop seeing it. The wrongness. Her laughter came a beat too late, too rehearsed. When she tucked her long, dark hair behind her ear, it was too perfect, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. The way she folded laundry neat. Mechanical wasn't how Vivian used to do it. It was subtle, maddening in its smallness, but it was there. The mirrors were next. I had always been indifferent to mirrors, saw them as tools, reflections of fact. But now, when I looked into one, the truth bent and twisted. One night, I stood in my office, pacing in front of the tall window that overlooked the city. I caught my reflection in the glass and froze. My reflection wasn't moving. It stood there, still as a photograph, staring back at me. Its mouth began to curl into a smile. My mouth. Only it stretched too far, too wide, as though someone were pulling it from the corners. I turned away, my breath hitching, and when I looked back, it was normal again. My reflection, hollow-eyed, a little disheveled. That was when I stopped trusting the world around. I began studying Vivian quietly, meticulously. I asked questions only she would know the answers to, but they were too simple, too obvious. She passed them all, but too well. "Remember Florence?" I said casually over dinner one night. "You cried when we saw the Duomo." She smiled fondly. "I did, but what did we fight?" The faintest flicker of hesitation crossed her face before she smoothed it over. "We didn't fight, Jacob. It was perfect. But we had fought." I'd forgotten her birthday during that trip. Too busy fielding calls from investors. She stormed off to a cafe for hours while I panicked, thinking I'd lost her. That memory was burned into my brain, as sharp as a blade. I stared at her across the table, my hands trembling beneath the wood. She just smiled, that placid, artificial smile, and sipped her wine. I found the photograph, so a week later, I had come home too early, and the house was quiet. I walked into her office to grab something, and noticed the bottom drawer was slightly ajar. Inside was a folder. It was thick, heavy. I opened it and froze. Photographs, hundreds of them, all of me at work, talking to my assistant, me pacing in my office, me sleeping, my mouth slightly open on my pillow, me brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror. They were taken at odd angles, through windows, cracks in doors. At the bottom of the pile was a list of names. My name was at the top, circled in red. I heard the front door creak open, and I shoved the folder back into the drawer. My pulse hammered as I stumbled back to the kitchen, forcing a smile. "Jacob?" she called. "You're home?" Her voice echoed through the hallway, but all I could hear was the blood roaring in my ear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to her, staring at the ceiling, feeling her presence beside me like a storm cloud. Around 3 a.m., she moved, slowly, deliberately. I watched her silhouette rise and stand at the foot of the bed. "Jacob," she said softly, "why don't you sleep anymore?" My throat felt raw, my hands clamped. "You're not real," I whispered. Her head tilted. Even in the dark, I could see the shadow of a smile stretch across her face. "You're so tired, love. You're seeing things." I bolted upright, my hand gripping the knife I kept under the pillow. "What are you?" I hissed. "I'm your wife," she said. "I always have been." I lunged, the knife flashing in the dark. Her scream pierced the room, so raw, so real. It stopped me mid-motion. My hand shook as the light flicked on. Blood smeared my fingers, and Vivian lay crumpled on the carpet, her eyes wide, her lips quivering. I saw it then in the mirror across the room. In the reflection, there was no knife. There was no blood. It was just me, kneeling on the floor, cradling her body like a child's doll, rocking back and forth, whispering her name. When they found me, I was alone in the room, staring into the mirror. The doctor said I snapped, that Vivian had died months ago in a car accident that I caused. They said my mind broke under the weight of guilt, that I created imposters and monsters to protect myself. But even now, as I sit in this stark white room, my wrists bound, I still see her in the reflection. She smiles at me, tilts her head, and I smile back. As the clock strikes midnight, deeper horrors emerge. Let's delve into the next tale. I've worked as a crime scene investigator for 25 years. This is my weirdest case. On the 25th of November 2018, the victim pulled into a budget motel in the early hours of the morning. He booked room 12 for a 3-day stay, and on the 4th day, the owner of the establishment sent his son to check on the victim. What he found was something that someone his age should never have witnessed, or anyone for that matter. By the time I arrived at the scene, it had already been cordoned off. Members of the county police department had swarmed the area, and in the absence of the sun, it was the blue and red flashing lights that cast their glow over the building. I made my way past the tenants who were half asleep, doing their best at giving witness testimonial. I stepped by a particularly shaken forensic pathologist who was trying to call his mother and entered room 12. Now, I've been working as a crime scene investigator for more than 20 years. I have dealt with some truly confounding scenes before. In 2006, a body of a missing hiker was found in the woods just on the county line. It had been burnt to a crisp, but only the upper half. Below the waist was completely untouched, as was the surrounding area. More recently, a farmer reported a break-in just after New Year's Eve. Presumably, someone had broken into his warehouse, which housed an industrial animal carcass shredder. It had been used in the night, and a pile of jellied flesh was found clumped at its mouth. Horrifically, it was eventually proven to be human, although couldn't be identified beyond that. Only one other thing was found at the scene. Within the remains was a small steel plaque, about the size of a business card, with the number 00029116 engraved. I say all this for simple context. I am no stranger to the unexplainable, but what I saw in room 12, it still keeps me up at night. The following are excerpts from the crime scene report I filed that day. Incident number 24,711, date of incident November 29th, 2018. Time of arrival 11:54 p.m. Location room 12, Sir Sleep-A-Lot Motel. Yellow Smoke County Reporting Officer Detective Arthur Graham. Yellow Smoke County Police Department. Victim name John Doe, name yet to be confirmed through fingerprint or DNA. Gender male, age estimated to be mid-40s, occupation unknown. Suspects none at present. The victim checked into the Sir Sleep-A-Lot Motel on the morning of November 25, 2018. He informed the motel owner, Mr. John Kelly, that he would be staying for 3 days. No known associates or visitors during the stay. Victim was found laying on bed in supine position. Victim had skin removed crudely. Patches of flesh hang loosely, revealing bone in some areas. Teeth indents on right part of pelvic bone will be examined. The victim's head is absent from the scene. Notably, the body had been dressed in what appeared to be women's undergarments, specifically a pair of lace stockings and a torn satin slip. Neither items of clothing belonged to the victim. The body was likely dressed post-mortem. Addendum. Marks on right part of pelvic bone were positively identified as being from a human juvenile, estimated as between the ages of 3 and 6. No dental record have been traced. Blood covers every inch of the room's 4 walls and carpet. The blood spray appears to be inconsistent with splatter from traumatic injury, possible use of pressurized device. The amount of blood was determined to be approximately 2 gallons, or 135% of the victim's total volume. Teeth were found on the room's desk, 33 in total, arranged into a circular pattern 10 inches in diameter. The careful arrangement appears to be ritual. The teeth are currently assumed to have been belonging to the victim. The location of the victim's head has not been identified. Addendum. The findings of the forensic odontologist have determined that 32 of the 33 teeth belonged to a person matching the victim's description, a Caucasian male in his 40s. One of the teeth matches a younger Caucasian female. It was eventually connected through dental records to be from 24-year-old Alyssa Hadland, reported missing in 1997. The Hadland case was archived in 1999 due to absence of evidence. The victim's tongue was discovered in the bathroom sink, exhibiting a complete severance at the base. The incision appeared clean and precise, suggesting the use of a surgical grade or extremely sharp cutting instrument. Notably, the tongue was found in isolation within the sink, devoid of any other biological material, indicating that it may have been intentionally relocated post-excision. First responders noted signs of tampering on the coin-operated television in the room, which intermittently activated to static approximately once an hour. The television will be deconstructed for forensic examination to recover latent fingerprints and other trace evidence related to its manipulation. Addendum. Both of the victim's eyes were recovered from the interior of the room's coin-operated television. The television screen had been removed, and the eyes were placed within the cavity, where the cathode ray tube was situated. This positioning suggests deliberate placement, indicating a possible symbolic motive. The only item of clothing found at the scene belonging to the victim was one pair of denim jeans, which witness John Kelly recalls being worn by the victim the morning he checked in. The jeans were contaminated with the victim's blood. In the pockets were found a one-way bus ticket from the towns of Cosgrave to Mayor's Income, one packet of apple-flavored gum, and a button. No other possessions of the victim were found. A pair of small, leather lace-up shoes were found at the foot of the bed. From the lack of blood stains, we can assume the shoes were placed there after the homicide. Addendum A. A shirt, likely belonging to the victim, was found 3 weeks later, partially buried in a field in San Tommaso, a small town 240 miles south of Yellow Smoke. The shirt matched the description given by John Kelly of the victim. Blood samples taken from the shirt were a strong match to those taken from the crime scene, although without the identity of the victim, a definitive link is challenging to corroborate. Addendum B. The small shoes found at the crime scene were dated to 1909 and determined to have some value among antique dealers. Due to their small size, they can be assumed to be children's shoes. The room showed no obvious signs of damage. The furniture appeared to have been undisturbed, although a Bible was missing from the bedside cabinet. Neither John Kelly nor his son David, lead witnesses of the case, recall seeing the victim with any luggage. For this reason, it is unclear if his possessions were taken or if he simply had none to begin with. The motive of this homicide remains unclear. I'll save you the rest of the procedural formalities. I've lost track of how many nights I've spent awake, staring at my computer screen, reading and rereading this report. It stayed with me for the past 6 years, constantly at the back of mind. At my personal behest, the case remained open despite insufficient evidence and a complete lack of any leads. When it was finally shelved at the beginning of this year, they were no closer to solving it than we were the day we found him. Earlier this week, I learned that it had been reopened by the FBI. I assumed that there must be someone else in this department who felt the same way about the case as I did, strong enough to reach out and request assistance from the feds. I was tasked with compiling any and all digital evidence we had on the case onto a USB flash. I felt weird combing through all the reports, files, and forensics. It felt like I was visiting an old friend. I added the documents I wrote up on the day, the dozens of crime scene photos and witness statements. I've studied them all meticulously myself. I doubted some Yale boy with a corner office could do any better. I kept trailing through the earmarked files, checking and double-checking if there was anything I'd missed. It was dark now. I spent the day working from home, hunched over my computer in my sorry excuse for a library. That's what my job mostly consists of now. I couldn't wait for retirement. Maybe then I would have the time to read some of these books I have lying around. I decided I was finished for the night. I'd squeezed every piece of relevant information I could find onto that hard drive. It was up to the FBI now. I only hoped that if our victim left any family behind, they could one day get some closure from this. I was about to shut my computer down when something caught my eye. Witness 1.mp3. It was an audio file. Somehow I hadn't noticed it before. Hell, I don't think I had even listened to it before. To my knowledge, all the witness statements taken that night were written. I clicked on it, figuring it must have been taken from David Kelly, the kid who'd found the body. I took a sip of my last dregs of coffee and sat back in my chair, jacking up the volume. The audio wasn't the best quality. It was shrouded in the static of an analog recording and, to my shock, the supposed first witnesses had a woman's voice. The following is a transcript of what was on that file. First responder, what were you doing in the area before you discovered the body? Witness 1, I'm staying in room 14, the room next door to where it happened. Been there for the past 2 weeks thereabouts. I've come on hard times recently, you know how it is. I was living out of a van until this, but it wasn't exactly reliable. First responder, apologies ma'am. I meant what were you doing immediately before discovering the body? Witness 1, right. Well, I came back from work around 9. I clean at the elementary school in town. I came back and spent the rest of the day in my room. I had dinner, and I was just catching up with the news before I went to sleep. First responder. Can you describe how and when you found the body? Witness 1. Gee, it must have been around 10. I was turning in for the night when I heard a banging noise from next door. I guessed he must have brought a lady friend over, so I tried my best to ignore it. But it kept getting louder. It didn't sound like a headboard neither, more like someone chopping wood. It was too much for me to ignore, so I got up to go complain. I found the door unlocked and it opened wide up when I knocked. That's when I saw him, that poor, poor man. First responder. Could you please describe the scene you came across as detailed as you can? Witness 1. It was terrible, just terrible. I saw my neighbor kneeling in the corner of his room. His head had been cut off. Can you imagine that? There was blood covering everything around him. I almost vomited there and then. Then I saw the man in the bathroom. There's a pause. First responder. Could you please go on? You said there was someone else at the scene? Witness 1. Yeah, a real weirdo. I didn't notice him at first. He was just peeking out from behind the bathroom door, watching me. When I did finally notice him, we just stared at each other for a moment or two. Then he just strolled out from his little hiding place. Another pause. First responder, please continue. I assure you everything you have to say will be of some importance to our investigation. Start by describing this man you saw. Witness 1. Okay then, he was a freak, I'll say it. When I got a good look at him, I saw that he had this great bulbous head. He was bald as a newborn, and the entire back part of his head was all deformed and sagging down. I think he had this disease. Oh, what's it called? A boy I went to school with had it. First responder. Are you thinking of hydrocephalus? Witness 1. Yes. Yeah, that's it. Hydrocephalus. But it was much worse than that kid I knew. Sorry if I'm coming across as rude, but it looked like some horrible octopus. And the front part of his head was far too thin. He has this pointy chin and cheekbones. His eyes were as bulging as his skull, all yellow and white. I think he had cataracts. Oh, and he must have been around 7 feet tall at least. He was hunching over where he met the ceiling. First responder. Can you describe what he was wearing? Witness 1. Sure. He had this battered old duster coat on. It was black, but he was covered in these stitched rags of red and green. The coat hung down to the floor, but I could make out the tips of brown leather boots poking out from the hem. First responder. Can you... Witness 1. Oh, pardon my interrupting, but the man, he was holding this. Well, I don't know what it was. It looked like a lobster pot with a handle, and must be 24 blades sticking out of it. Knives, mostly, and razor blades, axe heads, chains, that sort of stuff. Anyway, go on. First responder. Right. What did you do when he came closer to you? Witness 1. Well, I ran. I just ran. Out of the motel and down the road until I realized everything I owned was in my room. I didn't fancy having to start over from nothing for a third time, so I came back. And that's when you bumped into me. First responder. All right. And how long was it from discovering the body until you called 911? Witness 1. Oh, I didn't call 911, honey. First responder. You didn't? Witness 1. Oh no, by the time I came back from my little jog, the place was already crawling with police. I still haven't been allowed back in my room. First responder. Are you aware that... And... His speech became muffled after that until the recording was nothing but static hum that'd been in the background since the beginning. After hearing this for the first time, I didn't know what to think. I just sat in my old oak chair until my wife came in to tell me that she was going to bed. I kissed her goodnight and went back to aimlessly staring at the computer screen. Eventually, I closed it and stood up. I took the USB stick and left it on my desk. I left the room and locked the door behind me. I changed, washed, and climbed into bed with my wife. I kissed her on the back of her neck and tried to fall asleep. That thing that did this was still out there, but that wasn't my problem anymore. The nightmare has only just begun. Dare to uncover the next sinister story. We did something bad. Him and I do something bad every weekend. Whether it's steal things, practice our street art skills, or be a general menace to society. This time, we snuck into our old school building. We went through the heavy door on the first floor and turned directly right. The thick concrete walls of the stairwell greeted us. Up we went. The scent of age-old shiny blue paint on concrete is a unique one. I stuck my right hand out and let my manicure glide softly over the dark, glistening paint as we spiraled upwards, floor after floor. The paint was chipping in some places, smooth in others. The walls were at least several feet thick. No windows. Second floor, third floor, fourth floor. Up we went. Old brutalist architecture. Between each turn of the thick cement steps was a small landing, only a few feet wide though. We pushed upwards. 14th floor. The black number 14 stood out boldly against the blue background. We were at the top. The stairs ended and a long, dark hallway stretched out before us. We crept forward, trying to sneak deeper into the building, until we were greeted by them. I don't know who they were. 2 teachers? Some superintendents? Why were they here in the middle of the night? A medium-height man, black curly hair, a tall woman, chiseled cheekbones. Looking back on it, I think they were there just to protect the place. They opened their mouths, said some words. Without thinking, we lunged at them. We tussled with them, knocked the man out. I could still feel his grip on my shirt sleeve as he tried to hold on, slipping into unconsciousness. The woman retreated. Then, we ran. Back downstairs. Floor after floor after floor, spiraling downwards. How many floors has it been? I glanced up at the black numbers, painted against the cerulean blue. 14. What? I looked around. Kept running. Another floor down. 14. Another floor. Still 14. The cement looked strange, bulging in places. I looked at my partner's face, panicked. Has he noticed anything? He ran downwards. I followed. 4. The paint was skewed in places. No longer a straight diagonal strip parallel to the angle of the stairs. It whipped and lashed out. The walls were no longer straight either. The angles between the ceiling and the wall were smooth, curved. I think I glimpsed the man's body as I ran by. It lay on the stairs below me, his face twisted and strange, dented in. Another floor down. The stairs were no longer stairs. Globs of angular concrete jutted out towards us at strange angles, and each floor was getting smaller. I grabbed my partner's hand, panicked, looked into his eyes. He was doing his best to not look back at me, sweating. "Maybe we should go back up," he whispered. We pressed downwards yet again. Still, 4. A dead end. The cement was thick, arched and tapered towards us. I whipped my head around, looking for a way out. The man's face embedded in the cement. He looked like a dummy, looking down at us with a mannequin's eyes. His skin smooth, like the face of a doll that got punched too hard in the face. Unmoving. I could feel my partner's tug on my hand. He pulled me upwards. We ran back up, 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 up. I looked at the walls. They were thick. There were no windows, no doors, only the shiny, cold blue. We were running back upwards for hours. Where was the real floor 14? Where was the long hallway at the top of the building? We need to find the original woman and man, apologize to them. Even if I could find a sledgehammer and chisel our way out of the cement, what world awaited us outside? Was it home or something else? An endless void of cement that you could never come out of, even if you chiseled tunnels for hours. We ran upwards, hand in hand. 14, 14, 14, 14, 14, 14, 14, 14. 14. The walls were looking more and more normal for a while, until they weren't. It had been hours. It felt like we'd run up hundreds of floors, but it was still 14. There was no hallway. No door, no woman, no man. We hit another dead end. We ran back downwards, exhausted. The dead end came faster this time. The stairs no longer were stairs. The walls were barely walls. Slopes of cement, covered in blue. "Help, please. Get us out." From one shadow to the next, the fear intensifies. Enter the following tale if you dare. Something is always peeking at me. In the Amazon warehouse. I never expected to get a job at an Amazon warehouse during the holidays. I wasn't even looking for work, but after being short of gift money and hearing a friend talk about the decent pay, I figured it wouldn't hurt to give it a shot. They needed seasonal help, and my application was accepted almost immediately. It didn't take long to adjust to the routine. Pick the items, scan them, package them, and repeat. Simple enough. But something about that warehouse, it was more than just the constant hum of machinery or the dry, sterile cardboard box-smelling air that made the place feel off. It was the way the lights flickered in certain parts of the building, like they were struggling to stay on, and the eerie, echoing silence when you ventured too far down the aisles. It was never fully quiet, but the hum seemed to settle into a sort of muffled thrum when you were working in the farthest reaches of the rows of shelves. I was working the 3-2-11 shift, the shift that ensures you have no life, and you're running on fumes by the end. My days blurred together. There was no time for much else but the work and the rush of getting orders out before the end of the shift. On the first night, I noticed something odd. I was walking down an aisle, pushing my cart filled with picked orders, when I thought I saw a movement from the corner of my eye. A figure, barely there, retreating behind one of the towering stacks of packages. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. You get tired after hours of the same monotonous tasks, and the lights in the warehouse did their part to distort things in the periphery. But the next time I was down that aisle, I saw it again. A figure, just out of sight, peeking around the corner of a shelf. I couldn't make out details, but it was too deliberate, too calculated. Almost like it was waiting for me to come down the aisle, only to dart back just out of view. Probably just another worker, I muttered to myself. Get a grip. But as the days went by, it became harder to shake the feeling that something was following me. It wasn't just the quick glimpses of movement anymore. It was the odd, uncomfortable sensation that I was being watched. I'd turn corners, and for a split second, I'd catch a shadow peeking around the edge of the shelving units, as if it were waiting for me to come closer. The moments were brief, but they were enough to make me question myself. Was it my mind playing tricks? Or was I really being watched? The warehouse was massive and was probably 100 other workers. At first, I thought it might be one of my coworkers playing some sort of prank. There was a sort of camaraderie that came with the hours we worked, the jokes we shared, and the occasional quiet moments between picking orders. But the people I worked with didn't strike me as the type for childish games. Besides, why would they target me? I decided to confront it. The next time I spotted the shadow, I didn't look away. I didn't pretend I hadn't seen it. Instead, I walked directly toward the spot where the figure had ducked behind a shelf. I rounded the corner with a firm step, expecting to catch someone in the act. But when I looked, the aisle was empty. I frowned. My heart pounded in my chest. As I looked at the empty spot, I heard a small skittering behind me, almost like the patter of mouse feet. When I turned around, I caught the very edge of the figure again, ducking behind a shelf. For the rest of that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. No matter how I tried to focus on the work, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. Every time I walked down an aisle, I half expected to see someone peeking from the end, waiting, watching. But it never happened again, at least not in the open. It always happened just on the edge of my vision, almost like whatever it was adjusting their pace to match mine, to always stay in my peripheral vision. It was subtle. A soft scrape of feet against the concrete floors, just beyond where I could see. Sometimes I'd hear breathing, shallow and almost labored, coming from the darkened aisles. I'd stop. I'd listen. The noise would always stop the moment I did, as if it were waiting for me to continue moving forward. By the end of my first week, I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was in that warehouse with me. The feeling of being followed became unbearable. My mind was on edge, my nerves shot from hours of creeping unease. I'd hear the shuffle of feet behind me, but I'd turn, and no one would be there. I'd catch glimpses of movement, someone darting behind a corner, or a flicker of shadow in a dimly lit aisle. I tried telling my manager. His response was dismissive. "It's just the shift hours getting to you. The building's huge. You're just working yourself up." But as the days turned into weeks, it only got worse. The strange occurrences intensified. The peeking stopped being subtle. One night, I was deep in the warehouse, near the back row of shelves, when I saw something, or someone, standing at the far end, clearly visible now. The figure was taller than any worker I had seen, with a pale face peering out from behind a shelf. I could see its eyes, wide and glassy, staring directly at me. I froze. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. It was like the figure was pulling me toward it, like it had a gravitational pull I couldn't escape. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The figure wasn't there anymore. No sound, no movement, just silence. I should have run, but I couldn't make my legs move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat collecting on my back. I walked away slowly, not looking back, knowing that whatever I had seen was not something I was meant to confront. The next morning I tried to shake it off, but it was impossible. I was rattled, to the point where I could barely focus on the work. I kept thinking of the eyes staring at me in the dark, the unnatural stillness in the aisle. That was the moment I realized I wasn't imagining it anymore. Something was there, and it wasn't just watching me, it was stalking me. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit. My manager asked me if I would be willing to work one more shift Saturday night before I left. He had always been cool, so out of guilt I agreed. As I trudged back into the warehouse that night, I could feel the weight of something far heavier than exhaustion. There was a quiet dread gnawing at the back of my mind, a feeling that this place didn't want me here anymore. Still, I pushed it down. I could handle it. At least, that's what I told myself. The shift started uneventfully. The constant drone of forklifts and the soft hum of the overhead lights mingling together like white noise. My pick list was unusually light that night, mostly small orders that didn't take long to grab. Most of the other workers were scattered across the warehouse, their figures moving like shadows between towering shelves and aisles. The place felt emptier tonight than it had before, quiet. I had to pick an item from the far end of the warehouse, one of the isolated aisles in the corner, the part of the warehouse far from the main foot traffic, lit only by a few weak, flickering lights. It wasn't that far from my usual routes, but the longer I worked there, the more I noticed how different this part of the warehouse felt. It was colder, darker. The air seemed heavier, somehow. I took a deep breath as I wheeled my cart toward the far aisle. The lights overhead flickered, buzzing erratically before going steady again. The aisle stretched long ahead of me, stacks of boxes lining the walls. There was nothing but the sound of my shoes scraping against the concrete and the rhythmic clicking of the scanner as I went down the row, looking for the item on my list. Then I heard it. A soft skittering sound, like nails or claws scraping against the floor. I froze. My heart skipped, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. It came from behind me, further down the aisle. I swung around, scanning the shadows at the far end, but saw nothing. My breath caught in my chest as I waited for another sound. But the aisle was empty. Nothing. Maybe it was just a rat, I thought. The warehouse wasn't exactly pristine, and it was filled with crates and old equipment. Animals had a way of getting in. I turned back to my task, trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. But as I reached the end of the aisle, something felt off. The warehouse felt too quiet, too empty. The hairs on my arms stood up. Then the light above me flickered and died. Darkness. For a moment I was still. My eyes adjusted to the dim glow of distant lights further down the warehouse. I turned my head, but I couldn't see anything. The entire aisle had gone dark in an instant. A low, cold dread pooled in my stomach. Before I could react, the next light down the aisle flickered off. Then another. The darkness was creeping closer, like the slow advance of a tide. The lights above me, each one turning off in sequence, like a countdown. The darkness behind me was now eating its way toward me, consuming the aisle, step by step. A cold breath ran down my spine. I turned, my chest tightening with a slow, creeping terror. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was there. At the far end of the aisle, just past the flickering lights, I saw it. A figure, barely more than a silhouette against the darkened shelves, standing. Still, my heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run. But my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, locked in place by the impossible sight before me. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching. But I could feel its presence, the weight of it, pressing against the back of my skull, like it was waiting for me to make a move. And the lights kept turning off, one after another, until I was left in darkness, save for the fading glimmer at the far end. My breath caught. The figure took a step forward. The lights closest to me flickered out. It took another step. The darkness closed in like an unstoppable wave. And then, the last light above me died. I was swallowed whole by the blackness. The figure moved again, this time much closer. I could feel it, not with my eyes, but with every nerve in my body. It was there, in the shadows, just beyond my sight. The weight of its presence pressed against my skin, crawling into my bones. I couldn't take it anymore. Fear took hold of me. I dropped the package in my hand. I didn't care. I didn't care about the orders. I turned and ran. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the aisle as I sprinted toward the exit. Behind me, the sound of footsteps followed. Not the echo of my own, but something else. Closer. Too close. I didn't dare look back, but the sound of the footsteps behind me, faster now, rushing in pursuit, told me everything I needed to know. It was there. It was following me. With each step I took, I heard the skittering sound again, closer now. The scrape of claws against the concrete. The soft thud of something too heavy to be human. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to give out. But the footsteps were still there, and getting closer. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath ragged and uneven as I finally reached the end of the aisle. The bright, artificial lights of the main warehouse stretched ahead of me, but the footsteps were so close now, I could feel the presence looming just behind. I barely dared to glance over my shoulder. A shadow moved toward me, blocking the light. I didn't think, I just ran, arms flailing, the cold terror gripping my chest. When I reached the end of the aisle, I turned a corner, and the footsteps stopped. Silence fell, deafening and absolute. But the air felt different. The warehouse, once so full of mechanical hums and distant voices, was now still, silent. I stood there, panting, heart racing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. I didn't wait to find out. I bolted for the exit. I didn't stop running until I was out of the warehouse, standing on the cold concrete parking lot, gasping for air. I never went back. No more seasonal jobs. Just when you thought it was safe to turn off the lights, the next story beckons with unseen horrors. My family has a gruesome history. I know I will be next. The genealogy book sits heavy in my hands, its leather binding cracked and brittle, smelling of dust and something else is something older. Something that reminds me of dried blood and forgotten screams. My fingers trace the faded names, each one a testament to a legacy I never asked for but can never escape. My name is Ezra Pierce. I am the last. The morning light filters through the curtains of our modest suburban home, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floors. Lilith is in the kitchen, her pregnant belly a gentle curve against her pale blue nightgown. She's humming something a lullaby, perhaps completely unaware of the weight of history that pulses through my veins. I should have told her before we married, before we conceived our child. But how do you explain a hereditary nightmare that defies rational explanation? My father, Nathaniel, never spoke directly about the curse. Neither did his father, Jeremiah, or his father before him. It was always in hushed whispers, in sideways glances, in the way older relatives would grow silent when certain names were mentioned. The Pierce family tree was less a record of lineage and more a chronicle of horror. Each generation lost someone, always in ways that made local newspapers fall silent, that made police investigations mysteriously go cold, that made even hardened investigators look away and shake their heads. My great-grandfather, Elias Pierce, was found dismembered in a locked barn, every single bone meticulously separated and arranged in a perfect geometric pattern. No tools were ever found. No explanation ever given. My grandfather, Magnus Pierce, disappeared entirely during a family camping trip. Search parties found nothing, not a strand of hair, not a scrap of clothing. Just a small patch of ground where something had clearly happened. The earth scorched in a perfect circle, as if something had burned so intensely that it consumed everything around it, leaving only a memory of heat. My father, Nathaniel, he was discovered in our family's basement, his body contorted into an impossible position. Eyes wide open but completely white, no pupils, no iris, just blank, milky surfaces that seemed to reflect something from another world. And now, here I am, the last Pierce, with a wife who doesn't know, with a child growing inside her, unaware of the genetic lottery they've already been entered into. The genealogy book falls open to a page I've memorized 1,000 times. A loose photograph slips out a family portrait from 1923. My ancestors stare back, their faces rigid and unsmiling. But if you look closely, and I have, countless times, there's something else in their eyes. A knowledge. A terrible, suffocating knowledge. Lilith calls from the kitchen. "Breakfast is ready, love." I close the book. The eggs grow cold on my plate. Lilith watches me, her green eyes searching, a furrow of concern creasing her forehead. She knows something's wrong. She's always known how to read the subtle tremors in my silence. "You're thinking about your family again," she says. "It's not a question." I force a smile. "Just tired." But tired isn't the word. Haunted, terrified, trapped. My fingers unconsciously trace a small birthmark on the inside of my wrist, a strange, intricate pattern that looks less like a natural mark and more like a symbol. A symbol I've never been able to identify, despite years of research. It's been in every Pierce male's family photo, always in the same location, always identical. Lilith's pregnancy is now in her 7th month. The baby moves constantly, pressing against her skin like something desperate to escape. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I've watched those movements and wondered if it's trying to escape something more than the confines of her womb. The genealogy book remains open on the kitchen counter. I catch Lilith glancing at it, her curiosity barely contained. She knows I'm secretive about my family history. Most of my relatives are dead or disappeared, and the few photographs that remain are locked away in a fireproof safe in my study. "Tell me about your great-grandfather," she says suddenly. My hand freezes midway to my coffee mug. There's nothing to tell, I manage. But that's a lie. There's everything to tell. Elias Pierce, the first documented instance of our family's peculiarity. He was a cartographer, always traveling to remote locations, mapping territories no one had ever charted. His journals, the few that survived, spoke of places that didn't exist on any official map, places with geometries that didn't make sense, landscapes that seemed to breathe. The last entry, dated December 17, 1889, was a series of increasingly frantic sketches, impossible architectural designs, symbols that hurt your eyes if you looked at them too long. And at the bottom, in handwriting that grew more erratic with each line, "They are watching. They have always been watching. The map is not the territory. The territory is alive." Those were his final words. When they found him in that locked barn, his body systematically dismantled like a complex mechanical puzzle, the local sheriff's report read like a fever dream. Bones arranged in perfect mathematical precision. No blood, no signs of struggle, just reorganization. Lilith's hand touches my arm, pulling me back to the present. "Ezra, are you listening?" I realize I've been staring into nothing, my coffee growing cold, the birthmark on my wrist suddenly feeling hot, burning. "I'm fine," I lie. But the curse is never fine. The curse is always waiting, and our child is coming soon. The ultrasound images are wrong. Not obviously so. Not in a way that would alarm a typical doctor or technician, but I see it. The subtle asymmetries, the impossible angles, the way the fetus's bones seem to bend in directions that shouldn't be anatomically possible. Lilith keeps the images pinned to our refrigerator, a proud mother-to-be displaying her first glimpses of our unborn child. Each time I look, I feel something crawl beneath my skin, something ancient, something watching. Dr. Helena Reyes is our obstetrician. She's been nothing but professional, but I've caught her looking at me, not at Lilith, at me. Her eyes hold a recognition that makes my blood run cold. Everything is progressing. "Normally," she said during our last appointment, the pause before "normally" hanging in the air like a barely concealed lie. That night, I pulled out the old family documents again. Tucked between brittle pages of the genealogy book, I found a letter. The paper was so old it crumbled at the edges, but the ink remained sharp. Written by my grandfather Magnus, addressed to no one and everyone, "The child always comes. The child has always been coming. We are merely vessels, carriers. The lineage demands its continuation." What lineage? Continuation of what? Lilith sleeps beside me, her breathing deep and even. Her belly rises and falls, the shape beneath her nightgown moving in ways that feel calculated, deliberate. I trace my birthmark again. Under the moonlight streaming through our bedroom window, it looks less like a birthmark and more like a map to nowhere or everywhere. My father Nathaniel's final photographs are stored in a locked drawer in my study. I rarely look at them, but tonight feels different. Something is pulling me toward them, calling me. The photographs are strange, not because of what they show, but because of what they don't show. In each family portrait, going back generations, there's a consistent emptiness, a space, always in the same location, as if something has been deliberately erased, removed, but removed before the photograph was even taken. The baby kicks, hard, so hard that Lilith doesn't wake up, but I see her stomach distort, a shape pressing outward, not like a normal fetal movement, more like something trying to push its way out, something trying to escape, or something trying to enter. I close my eyes, but I can still see the map, the territory, the birthmark burning like a brand. Our child is coming, and I am terrified of what will arrive. The old courthouse record sits spread across my desk, a constellation of pain mapped out in faded ink and brittle paper. I've been researching our family history for weeks now, driven by something more than curiosity, something closer to survival. Every Pierce male in the last 5 generations died or disappeared before their 35th birthday. Not a coincidence, not anymore. My father, Nathaniel, gone at 34. My grandfather, Magnus, vanished at 33. Great-grandfather, Elias, found mutilated at 35. The pattern is too precise to be random. I've collected newspaper clippings, court documents, medical records. Not the dramatic, sensational evidence one might expect, but the quiet, bureaucratic trail of destruction. Police reports with missing pages, coroner's files with critical information redacted, insurance claims that never quite add up. Lilith finds me here most nights, surrounded by these documents. She doesn't ask questions anymore, just brings me coffee, watches me with those green eyes that seem to hold more understanding than she lets on. The baby's room is almost ready, she says softly, placing a mug beside me. I look up. The nursery door stands open. Pale yellow walls, carefully selected furniture, everything perfect, too perfect. Have you ever wondered, I ask, why some families seem marked by tragedy? She sits down, her pregnancy making the movement careful, calculated. Some people are just unlucky, but I know it's more than luck. Something runs in our blood, something that doesn't care about love or hope or the carefully constructed life we've built. The birthmark on my wrist throbs. Not painfully, just present, a constant reminder. I pull out the most disturbing document. A psychological evaluation of my grandfather Magnus, conducted 2 months before his disappearance. The psychiatrist's notes are clinical, detached. Patient exhibits extreme paranoia regarding familial curses. Demonstrates intricate delusion of systematic family destruction. Fixates on biological determinism. Shows no signs of schizophrenia, but persistent ideation of inherited trauma suggests deep-seated psychological mechanisms at play. Inherited trauma. The words echo. What if our family's destruction wasn't supernatural? What if it was something more insidious? A genetic predisposition to self-destruction. A psychological pattern so deeply ingrained that each generation unconsciously recreates the same narrative of loss? Lilith's hand touches my shoulder. Coming to bed? I nod, but my mind is elsewhere, calculating. The baby is due in 6 weeks. I have 6 weeks to understand what's happening to our family. 6 weeks to break a cycle that has consumed generations. 6 weeks to save our child. If I can. The research consumes me. I've taken a leave of absence from work. My entire study transformed into a makeshift investigation center. Genetic reports, psychiatric evaluations, family medical histories stretching back over a century. Each document another piece of a horrifying puzzle. Dr. Helena Reyes agrees to meet me privately. She's a geneticist, specializing in inherited psychological disorders, recommended by a colleague who knew something was unusual about my family history. Her office is sterile, meticulously organized. Nothing like the chaotic landscape of my own research. The Pierce family presents a fascinating case study, she says, sliding a manila folder across her desk. Generational patterns of self-destructive behavior, early mortality, and what appears to be a consistent psychological profile. I lean forward. What profile? She hesitates, professional detachment wavering for just a moment. Extreme risk-taking behavior, persistent paranoia, a documented inability to form long-term emotional connections. Each generation seems to unconsciously recreate traumatic family dynamics. My grandfather Magnus, my father Nathaniel. Their lives were a series of broken relationships, isolated existences, careers marked by sudden, inexplicable failures. And me? I'd fought against that pattern, married Lilith, built a stable life. Or so I thought. There's something else, Doctor. Reyes continues. We've identified a rare genetic mutation, not something that causes a specific disease, but a variation that affects neural pathways related to threat perception and stress response. She shows me a complex genetic map, chromosomal variations highlighted in clinical blue. In simplest terms, she explains, your family's brain chemistry is fundamentally different. You're neurologically primed for a perpetual state of threat detection. Imagine living with the constant sensation that something terrible is about to happen, every single moment. I know that feeling intimately. Lilith is 8.5 months pregnant now. The baby could come any day. And all I can think about is the pattern, the curse, the genetic inheritance that seems to hunt my family like a predator. That night I dream, not of monsters or supernatural entities, but of a simple, terrifying truth. What if the real horror is inside us, coded into our very DNA? What if our child is already marked? The contractions started at 3:17 a.m. Lilith's grip on my hand was vice-like, her breathing controlled despite the pain. The hospital room felt smaller with each passing minute, the white walls seeming to close in. Dr. Reyes was there. Not our usual obstetrician, but the geneticist who had been studying our case. Her presence felt deliberate, calculated. Everything is progressing normally, she said. The same phrase she'd used before. But nothing about our family had ever been normal. Hours passed. The rhythmic beep of monitors, the soft rustle of medical equipment. My mind kept circling back to the research, the genetic markers, the documented family history of destruction. At 11:42 a.m., our son was born. A healthy cry pierced the sterile hospital air. Normal. Perfectly. Wonderfully normal. Dr. Reyes ran her standard tests, blood work, genetic screening. I watched, my entire body tense, waiting for some sign of the curse that had haunted my family for generations. Nothing. Weeks turned into months. Our son Gabriel grew strong, healthy. No signs of the psychological fractures that had destroyed my father, my grandfather, our ancestors. No mysterious disappearances. No unexplained tragedies. I submitted every piece of medical documentation to Dr. Reyes. Comprehensive reports, psychological evaluations, each document a testament to Gabriel's complete normalcy. The genetic markers? I asked her during one of our final consultations. The predisposition to self-destruction? She looked tired, professional. Sometimes, she said, breaking a cycle is possible, not through supernatural intervention, but through understanding, through choice. Lilith found me one night, surrounded by the old family documents, the genealogy book, the newspaper clippings, the medical records that had consumed me for so long. Are you ready? She asked. I understood what she meant. That night, I built a fire in our backyard, watched the papers curl and burn, the history of destruction, the weight of inherited trauma, turning to ash. Gabriel played nearby, laughing, innocent, unaware of the darkness I was burning away. For the first time in generations, a Pierce male would live, truly live. The curse was over. The echoes of the last tale still linger, but a more haunting story awaits. I saw the spirit, that haunts the fog, by the Everest Christmas Tree Farm. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning as white as the surroundings were. I had taken this route so many times before, but tonight seemed different. Maybe it was that I was alone this time. Maybe it was because the fog was thicker than I had ever seen it. All this, coupled with the snow, it made it so much worse to try and see anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore the feeling and continued on. I was always a bit stubborn, and I was determined to make it home with my prize before it got even harder to see. I pushed forward, ignoring the little voice in my head telling me to turn back. I had to get back home with the damn tree. Every year it was tradition to go to the Everest Christmas Tree Farm and get a tree for the family. I lived the closest, but I really did not like going. I was not sure why, but I just did not like the place. Something unnerved me about it since I was a kid. Unfortunately, I was the only one who could get the tree back to my parents' place this time. Because of the snow and the timing, I had to go alone. What was worse is that I was late leaving work, and it was the last day to get the tree and trim it before Christmas. I would be lucky to get there in time before they closed. Though I admit I was a bit scared for some reason going alone, I was thankful that my family was not with me in this blizzard. If something happened, it would just be me who suffered. I made a bit more progress, but my heart sank as I heard a terrible sound coming from the engine. My car suddenly sputtered and came to a halt. The engine had died. I let out a frustrated sigh and checked my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely alone, stranded on an icy, deserted road in the middle of the night. I stepped out of my car and into the freezing fog, the cold and damp air wrapping around me like a shroud. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, and the only sound was the crunch of ice and snow underfoot. I started walking, hoping to find a phone signal or at least a house where I could ask for help. This area was sparsely populated, and even if someone's house was here, I could barely see it in the haze of whitened fog. I thought I might not be too far away from the tree farm, but could not be sure. The fog seemed to grow even thicker as I walked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I trudged on, my thoughts began to drift to memories of my past. Memories of the years I had come here before. I started feeling a strange sense of dread. I remembered every year we would arrive. We would always look at the trees closest to the farm. It was a large farm and plenty of trees were available, but I always looked near a taller hill in the back of the farm and saw larger trees beyond. The ones further back were technically part of the tree farm as well, but my parents always told us not to go that far back. We could get lost in the tall, densely packed trees. I shuddered as I started to see tall trees in the path, and I remembered vague details about a certain year. My brother and I did not listen to the rule and went to go play in the trees near the hill. I remembered getting lost. My brother and I got separated, and then I saw something in the trees I could not recall. All I could remember was it scared me. I pushed the memory aside and focused on the present. I walked on and saw the snow-covered sign indicating Everest Christmas Tree Farm. I had made it, and I thought maybe if they were still open, they could help me get a tree and get help to fix my car. I walked up to the main building where they normally sold the pre-prepared trees, and to my dismay, I saw no one around. I looked by the adjacent house and around the grounds of the farm and did not see anyone. There were not even any parked vehicles in the driveway, and I was starting to worry that the place was abandoned and everyone had left somewhere. I slumped my shoulders and tried to decide if I should keep looking or try someplace else. It was getting even colder, and I could not stay out here all night to wait. As I considered what to do, I noticed the freezing fog begin to thicken and intensify, and it seemed to be following me specifically. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper in the fog. It sounded like my name, and it made my blood run cold. I stopped in my tracks and looked around, but I couldn't see anyone. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding faster with each step. The fog seemed to be closing in on me, as if it was trying to swallow me whole. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, and I just wanted to get out of there. I started running past the main buildings and through rows of frosted trees. It was chasing me. The fog forced me to press on, and I got to the edge of the main farm grounds and saw the ghostly images of trees standing silent on the hill above. I stopped and felt an irrational wave of terror course through me. I did not want to go up that hill into the tall trees beyond. Something was out there, some half-remembered horror that I could not recall. I looked behind me and thought I might have escaped the nebulous grasp of the frigid fog. But then I saw a figure emerge from the vapors surrounding the trees on the hill. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. She had a serene and otherworldly beauty, but there was something unsettling about her. I realized that what terrified me was that I remembered her face. All of the sudden, I felt like a child again. I tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to look away from the woman. She seemed to float towards me, her feet not even touching the ground. As she got closer, I could see that her eyes were black and empty, and a chill ran down my spine. She stopped in front of me and whispered my name again, her voice like a soft hiss. I finally found my voice and managed to stammer out, "Who are you?" The woman just smiled, a hauntingly beautiful smile, and pointed up the hill. I felt a cold hand grip my heart, and I could feel the fear consuming me. I had always been skeptical of ghosts and the supernatural, but in that moment, I knew there was no denying their existence. The woman's smile turned into a sinister grin, and she reached out to touch me. I closed my eyes, expecting to feel her icy hand on my skin, but instead, I felt a sudden gust of wind and a loud crash of thunder. When I opened my eyes, the woman was gone, and I was standing in the middle of a clearing surrounded by ancient-looking trees. The fog had dissipated, and the moon shone down on me, casting an eerie light on the surroundings. I looked at my arms and legs, and I was a kid again. In fact, I remembered the outfit I was wearing. I felt lost and out of place. Then I remembered I was lost. This was when I had gotten lost in the trees on the hill above the farm. My parents were looking for me. This was some sort of memory I was living through again. I felt alone and terrified. The memory came rushing back, and the fear was as palpable as it was back then. I tried to make sense of it all, but before I could process anything, I heard a voice behind me. "Help me," remember the voice said. I turned around and saw the ghosts. They were everywhere, floating around me in a haze of mist and fog. Some were whispering my name, while others appeared to be in pain or angry. The nightmare image of the ethereal forms dancing and cavorting through the air was too much, and I turned and fled. The terror compelled me to run, but I felt a sudden weight in my steps and I slowed to a stop. I looked back and saw the ghostly form of the woman again. She stared at me and pointed again, further up the hill, and floated before me in silent judgment, never uttering a word. Memories flooded back, but this time they were clearer. They brought understanding and a sense of purpose. I finally remembered. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, all the while feeling the ghost's presence leading me on. Then I saw it, the clearing in the forest. I remembered it well, despite trying to deny the memory and suppress its very existence. My body trembled as I looked down, just as I did so many years ago. It was then that I saw her, again, her body being slowly buried in a small clearing in the forest on the hill. I saw her long hair laying on the ground, saw her lifeless eyes staring at me, cowering behind a nearby tree. I saw an outstretched arm and heard the slow, methodical digging of a large, faceless man, slowly burying her in an unmarked grave. The full weight of the memory came back to me and made me reel with the potency of it. I had seen her there. I saw her there and never said anything. I was terrified, too afraid of getting in trouble for getting lost, too afraid of finding something I shouldn't have, and most of all, too afraid if that man found out I told someone. I saw it all in silent terror, and I never told anyone. I blinked my eyes and I was back to my own body, at least my body in the correct time. I knew what I had to do. I claimed a shovel from the tool shed near the farmhouse and trudged up the frozen hill in silence, the spectral aura of the spirit never leaving the periphery of my vision. I traced a path I had no idea I remembered. I found the small clearing and I took the shovel in hand and started digging. It was not long before I had found her, what was left of her after all these years. I looked up in shame at the terrible face of the spirit. She did not look angry, she just looked thoughtful. She nodded to me, and the heavy fog enveloped her, and she vanished before my eyes. The snowfall had lessened, and the fog had begun to clear up as well. I reverently covered the bones and marked the spot they rested in. I started back down the hill and thought of the man I had seen burying the body back then. I could not recall his face, but it made me think of a big story I had heard about on the news a few years ago. I vaguely remembered hearing about a man arrested in this county for the murder of several women who had gone missing. They never found all of the women, but I realized I had likely found one of his victims back when I was a child. I had a call to make to the police. I knew that someone, somewhere, had gone missing, and maybe if their families could have closure, it would be enough for the spirit to find some peace. I returned to my car and the desolate road. I turned the key, and the car sprang to life. I don't know how it had started working again. Suddenly, my phone was ringing. I answered it and heard my mom's worried voice on the other end. "Where are you? We have been trying to call you for hours." I told her the truth. I had been held up by the weather. I apologized and told her I could not get a tree, but I was safe and on the way back now. I looked around and saw that the fog had lifted and the storm had passed. It was as if nothing had happened. As I drove home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace and relief wash over me. And as I looked back at the road, I hoped that I would never be afraid of that place again. As the fog thickens, so do the mysteries. Let's venture into the next chilling account. My name is Harvey Walsh, a name I cling to these days as proof that I remain unchanged. Human. Everyone around me seems different now, despite their constant insistence that it's all in my head. Something changed one day, yet somehow didn't. You might think I'm going crazy from all the pills I was taking, but I stopped those a while ago. They didn't help my problem, they only made it worse. It started small. Tiny inconsistencies in the world around me, like watching a familiar movie where the dialogue was slightly off. My neighbor Tom would water his lawn at exactly 7:43 every morning, his movements following the same arc, down to the precise bend of his wrist. The barista at my local coffee shop began drawing identical patterns in every latte-perfect spirals that never varied. These were little things, easy to dismiss, until they weren't. Watching my neighbors and coworkers is like observing people rehearsing how to be themselves. Their gestures and speech carry a touch too much deliberation, like actors perfecting roles they don't quite understand. The wrongness of it makes my skin crawl, but who can I tell when everyone around me has become a perfect replica of themselves? Then came the dreams, nightmares. Even that word fails to capture their weight. They began last month, and now, whenever I close my eyes for more than a minute, my body betrays me. It's as if someone flips a switch and I'm out. Even when I fight to stay awake, my consciousness slips away the moment my eyelids drop. I jerk awake, drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me like restraints. Tonight was no different. I forced myself to stay awake, but it didn't matter. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back on that train, the 8:43 to downtown. The familiar unease crept in as I looked around at my fellow passengers, some reading news, others absorbed in their phones, a few waiting listlessly for their stops. Until it started. A sound erupted, a scream, visceral and raw, echoing through the train's walls. It was agonizing and distorted, like nails scraping across a blackboard but emanating from human mouths. The passengers collapsed in unison, their screams matching the first. Bodies jerked and slumped, limbs moving like tangled puppets on invisible strings. The lights flickered and died. In the darkness I could hear them, wet sliding noises and stiff, unnatural creaks that shouldn't come from human joints. The sounds were rhythmic, precise, like an assembly line at work. When the lights returned, they were back in their seats, perfectly still. Their heads snapped upright with a sound like splintering wood, eyes facing forward, until they turned. Their eyes. God, their eyes. Each iris held a tinge of gold and red, like a solar eclipse painted on flesh. They didn't blink. They didn't move. Their heads remained perfectly still as their eyes tracked me. A woman 3 seats ahead had her arm bent backward at an impossible angle. It hung there until it snapped into place with a stiff, awful crack. I woke up gasping, but the horror clung to me. Their eyes followed me into the waking world. I began seeing flashes of them golden red ringsin reflections, in mirrors, windows, even in the blank screen of my phone. Always watching, always present, just for a moment before vanishing. I went to Dr. Lyra because I had nowhere else to turn. Simple tasks had become mountains. I couldn't function. She diagnosed it as stress and prescribed pills that made the world blur around the edges, not my vision, but my mind. Reality itself seemed smudged, painted over with something more, perfect. When I stopped taking them, I thought it was over. But the world sharpened too much. Colors became richer, sounds crisper, everything carried a weight that felt unnatural. Beneath it all, I started hearing things. Soft, stiff creaks when people moved. The faint click-click of pupils adjusting to light. During my last appointment, Dr. Lyra's face lingered too long in a smile, as though she'd forgotten to stop. "How are the pills working, Harvey?" she asked, her tone breezy but flat. Her voice echoed strangely in the room, hollow like a metal chamber. When I told her I wasn't taking them anymore, her expression froze. Everything stopped, not just her face, but the room itself. For a fraction of a second, I swear I saw her flicker, like a TV losing signal. Then she resumed, too quickly. Her voice piled on top of itself as her smile stretched wider than humanly possible. "That's great news. Wonderful progress. But I think you should keep taking them just a little longer, for safety." Her hands trembled as she shoved another bottle into my hands, and I saw something, moving beneath her skin, as if her veins were alive and rearranging themselves. I should have listened, but I didn't. That's when I started noticing changes everywhere. The old corner store, once grimy and cluttered, gleamed with impossible cleanliness. The cashier, Mrs. Always so grumpy and loud, stood behind the counter wearing an empty smile. Her head tilted exactly 15 degrees as she rang up my items. Then I saw the cat. It sat by the road, perfectly still. Too still. Its posture was rigid, unnatural. When I approached, reaching out despite my instincts, its fur felt wrong, too smooth, synthetic, like plastic fibers pretending to be real hair. Its head turned in sharp, stiff increments, click, 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 and its eyes, those golden red rings, like camera shutters adjusting their focus. My breath caught, and the cat bolted, its movements precise and segmented. I ran home and haven't left since. From my window, I watch, and I see it all. My neighbors' movements are too synchronized, their routines perfect. Mrs. Peterson waters her flowers at exactly 9:17 a.m. Children play jump rope in flawless rhythm. Even their laughter stops and starts at precise intervals, as if on cue. Whatever is happening, I need to figure it out before it gets to me. Am I going crazy? Am I being paranoid? The logical part of my brain screams that none of this is possible, but I've seen too much to trust logic anymore. A knock at my door broke through my thoughts. 3 precise taps, evenly spaced. Peering carefully from the corner of my window, relief washed over me as I recognized the visitors. My parents stood on the porch, wearing worried expressions that didn't quite reach their eyes. Of course, I hadn't been making my usual calls. I let them in, and they slipped into their roles. Mother nagging about my self-care, father heading to the kitchen with bags they'd brought. My mom switched to that gentle voice she'd always used when I was upset. Maybe this was what I needed after my self-imposed isolation. Maybe it was all just in my head. After all, I couldn't be wrong about my own parents. I felt warmth emanating from her as she held my hands, though something about her touch felt rehearsed. My dad was laughing in the kitchen, joking about what I'd been doing all this time. I finally felt relaxed, experiencing peace I hadn't known in weeks. Mom let me doze in her lap, just like when I was small. Her hand stroked my hair in perfect metronomic motions. Dad came in and saw me half asleep. He went to the cabinet and retrieved something. Through my drowsy haze, I saw Mom's smile shift, becoming more like Dr. Lyra's, more like Mrs. Chen's, more like the cat's mechanical grin. She held my head still as Dad pressed that familiar pill to my lips. "Just take your medicine, dear," she whispered, her voice harmonizing with mechanical undertones. "Everything will be clearer once you stop fighting it." As darkness began to take hold, I heard snippets of their conversation, but the voices, no, it couldn't be. "Why are we still keeping this one?" My mother's voice had lost all warmth, becoming clinical and detached, layered with whirring sounds. An experiment, more or less," my father's voice replied. But the familiar deep tone held none of its usual affection. The longest-lasting subject yet. Fascinating how he senses something's wrong, but can't quite grasp what. Before my vision finally dimmed, I saw her face above me, frozen in that too-wide smile. Her eyes rotated those golden red rings locking onto me. I try to fight the darkness, but I know it's too late. It always was. Note found scratched into the bedside table unseen. "Don't take the pills. The silence after the scream is fleeting. Another horror is about to unfold." You wake up, and you know it's the end. But you've trained for this, and you're ready. As ready as anyone can be anyway. We've woken you up just in time to put you back to sleep. When you open your eyes and see me lying on the gurney across from you, it's supposed to get you thinking about the things you aren't supposed to think about. When you see the steel sphere between us at our feet and realize what it does, it's supposed to help bring those secrets closer to the surface. We both have oxygen masks on, IV drips in, and various tubes and needles nearby that they'll poke and prod us with if we're under too long. Our heads have been shaved and a dozen small nodes are attached. I've only lost a month's worth of hair. I'm sure you've lost more. I wonder if that ever bothers the people we bring into this place, or if the mind doesn't make time for vanity in the face of death. We're preparing for a long trip together. Neither of us tries to speak. Oxygen masks aside, we're about to have our own private conversation. But my eyes tell you that this is the end, and your glare reminds me that you'll do everything you can to take me down with you. The people in the lab coats, scientists or doctors or spies, whatever they are, start counting down from 60 seconds. The lights on the bathysphere machine at our feet start flashing red, and although I have done this before many times, my heart still speeds up. Someone touches my earpiece and reminds me of my name, and I hold on to it as they turn on the sedative, flooding my mask. I look over just as your eyes are closing. Together, as the countdown hits 10 seconds, we descend. When I wake up on the other side, it takes time to adjust. Every few seconds in my earpiece, I hear, "You've entered the sunlight zone. Your name is Edgar Morris." And it keeps going until I buzz in and say acknowledged. Zone 1 is recent memories. It's what happened to the target just before they were caught, and the things on their mind. It's like a dream, but more focused. I see the target clearer now. A woman with long, dark hair, the way it must have been before they caught her. And hazel eyes now, like mine. I think they'd been green before. but I push that thought to the side and focus on the mission. If they were green before then, I'll need every ounce of focus. We're in the woods, but not any forest I recognize. It's all pine near our base, at the few forests that remain anyway. But she'd been snatched somewhere tropical. Glossy leaves and flowers and the memory of the sun beating down hard surround us. Panic and sweat and adrenaline overshadow everything. She knows they're going to get her, that we're going to get her. She's not as scared as they usually are, but the fear is still there. I get just the big picture of her thoughts. She's worried about her cat of all things. Hidden in her mind are potentially world-ending secrets. Lives ending in the most gruesome ways, and governments falling or rising depending on what she has. And that's what she's thinking about, her fucking cat. I reach out, trying to probe further as I walk closer to her in the dreamscape. I try to feel for thoughts of children, parents, lovers, but there's nothing. Perhaps that's why she wasn't as scared as the others. She didn't have anyone she could take down with her. No one she loved anyway. The forest around us shifted if I looked at it too long. Ferns turned to wildflowers. Fronds turned to pine needles. I refocused, keeping my memories out as best as possible. I zeroed in on the heat and the bugs, trying to immerse in her world. She's not running in the dreamscape, but she is out of breath, sort of in limbo, standing but looking confused. I stay near her, taking in everything I can, but nothing I'm not supposed to. I see hints of a building or structure in the distance, but that's not for my eyes. When I feel like I've seen and felt everything useful on the surface, I get closer to her and she senses me. She turns around slowly, but by the time she sees me, my hand is on her shoulder, and we're descending once again. Each level is more disorienting than the last, as the pressure builds. I hear several repeats of, "You've entered the Twilight Zone. Your name is Edgar Morris," before I get my bearings enough to radio back and acknowledge. Like its namesake, the drop-off into the next zone is sharp. Things are quick to become more emotional and abstract. Vision and hearing stay mostly intact, but other senses start to blur. I'm in her domain now, whoever she is. I hear the sound of children playing, and I feel carefree in a way I haven't in decades. She's brought me far into the past. That's become the common practice. Think about safe memories, what you were doing when you were too young to have important secrets, and maybe even win some measure of sympathy from your captors. But that wouldn't work, not with us. Not at this level anyway. I think back to who I know that has green eyes and pale skin, but stop myself. Any distractions could mean death. She's brought me to a birthday party. We're outside somewhere hot, but I can't be sure if it's the same climate as the one she was caught in. I see her running across the lawn, aged 6 or 7, with a group of other children. Her hair was lighter then, but I know it's her instantly because no one else ever feels quite real down here but the target. A little boy a few years younger than her trails beside her. He's calling for her to slow down. He's calling her Dottie. That's her name then, Dottie. If we didn't already know that, we've got it now. I make sure to take in everything around me, as the boys upstairs will be watching too. I'd watched back my first mission years ago. The scanners filled in the gaps. They added logic where there wasn't. The hills behind the house shifted if I looked at them too long, growing taller or shorter, but played back they'd be static. Faces, unless they were ones she remembered well, would be filled in with approximations. I left Dottie alone, taking in as much intel as I could on what I was supposed to. I walked across the grassy lawn, the blades shifting like the ocean if I looked too closely, and zoomed in on the other faces of people she might be close to. I walked up to different adults and glanced at them, but they ignored me, their faces bare of any features. There were only 2 adults whose faces Dottie seemed to remember clearly, and I made sure to get good shots for the boy's topside. The man had the same hazel eyes as Dottie, and I figured we likely had her parents. Her mother had the same short, sort of choppy hairstyle as my mother had worn when I was a child, so Dottie was likely the same age as me. I pushed that thought to the side when her mother's hair started turning blonde like mine. I needed to focus. There didn't seem to be much that Dottie recalled apart from her family. I caught up with her at a picnic table singing happy birthday to a little girl whose face she didn't really remember, and I watched the little girl blow out her candles with a mouth that only appeared when she opened it. Her eyes were mere suggestions on a tan slab. I'd seen everything of value here. It was time to move on, either by my hand or hers. I'd gotten close enough that Dottie was watching me, her party hat falling off her small head. I wondered if she'd acclimated yet. I quickly had my answer. The scene change was instantaneous but not disorienting. We were still at twilight. Suddenly, we were in a hallway at a school, and she was a few years older. She was trying to blend in with the crowd, but it didn't work, because she didn't remember any of their faces. I picked her out right away. I chased after her, eventually passing a teacher whose face she remembered clearly, an old woman. I slowed down just enough to send a clear picture of the woman's face topside. I got closer and suddenly we were camping, somewhere with snow this time. I forced my mind blank, the familiarity immediately trying to bring up my own memories of childhood romps in the snow. There were pine trees here, and I saw them clearer than the other forest we'd been to, but likely only because I was filling in the gaps with my own memories. I zipped open the tent in front of me and found Dottie's parents waiting inside, but there was no sign of her. I already knew what they looked like, so I didn't bother taking in their faces, though I did note the absence of the suspected little brother from earlier, and the ragged clothes they wore as they held their foreheads together. Perhaps they were camping out of necessity rather than fun. When I stepped outside, fresh tracks in the snow gave her away instantly. This was her mistake. I'd grown up in the snow, and I was still my current self. She had shorter legs now, and she stumbled in the unfamiliar terrain. She fell to the ground, and I caught up to her. She was perhaps 12 or so in this memory, keeping me out of anything important. Usually, this part of the process could take hours, and I braced for another scene change, but it didn't come. She could have run through every banal event. One target had taken me through every choir concert, every track meet, every school play. It was strange that she didn't try that. She simply sat up and waited, glaring me down. It made me wonder if perhaps she didn't take me through those distractions because she simply didn't have them. An entire life defined by the war wouldn't be unusual. It was on me to take us down again. She didn't try to run. Instead, she turned to face me and held out her hand. I took it and helped her up as we dropped down another level. You've entered the midnight zone. Your name is Edgar Morris. I don't know how long I'd been listening to that on a loop before I radioed back, acknowledged. I opened my eyes slowly, and it's the opposite of waking up. The midnight zone is sometimes all we need. It's your passions, your loves, the core of who you are as a person. I don't know what the boys upstairs are looking for, but it's possible it's right here. It's the feelings first in this zone. Emotions that aren't my own. Determination, passion, and hatred above all else. Then the room comes into view and it's familiar. Not only to her, but to me. The architecture is different, of course, more tan than gray, with drywall instead of wood and metal, like it was once something else, something comfortable before the war necessitated change. But the purpose is the same as the buildings I've spent so much time in. We're in a classroom in a training facility. The windows are open, but I don't see anything of value at first glance. The teacher is unmasked, and Dottie knows their face well. The boys upstairs will now too. I start looking around and get just a glimpse of the man beside us when Dottie starts to peel away from her memory. I have to decide if I run or try to get as much intel as possible. Even one face would be invaluable to us, so I stay put and send the face of the man next to me upstairs. Then Dottie remembers where we are. She reaches out and grabs my face in her hands, stopping me. She says simply, "You already have him. You can't have them." We descend. You've entered the abyssal zone. Your name is Edgar Morris. The abyss is where the brain realizes that there is an intruder present and that it can defend itself. The brain pulls out all the stops and weaponizes itself in a way that's specific but different for everyone. It singles out your worst memory and brings it to the surface. Sometimes that would be as simple as watching a grandparent die of cancer or watching a bomb strike from a distance. Sometimes it would be much worse. For the accidentally well-defended, it would be where our agents would watch their leg get blown off in a prairie, or watch a friend get shot in the head. But the memories aren't limited to wartime. Agents go through the target's worst memories with them, whenever they happened. Sometimes they would find themselves holding a baby as it died, or left alone as a child with someone they should never have been alone with. For the agents who weren't well defended, intel was easy to extract. Enemy agents would see a car crash or a sad farewell in a hospital, and that would be that. When the bathyspheres were in their infancy, only the truly unlucky could defend themselves well. After the machines became common knowledge, we realized we could create our own defenses. The only limit was how far you could push your own people before they broke, or worse, turned on you. Interrogation resistance was dialed up to 11. We started torturing our own people just to torture the enemy. In a way, things went back to the time before the bathyspheres, when information was extracted with pain. Those without particularly harsh and disturbing memories were punished the most, so they wouldn't be helpless in the face of capture. We called it enhanced defense training. The practice became the ultimate equalizer. It made us all the same amount of fucked up. Our methods were much lighter than what the enemy would do to our people if they caught us, of course. But those tasked with doling out defense training were always quick to remind recruits that their methods had been modeled after their enemies. This had all been a bit after my time. I had plenty to defend myself with already, but apparently Dottie hadn't. The first time I entered a target, their emotions were overwhelming, all-encompassing. It made me realize that everyone feels things differently, and that I felt less than most. The small glimpses I'd gotten into others' lives, and their feelings, had helped me acclimate a little bit more each time, but it was never easy. At this level, I'm almost completely tuned into Dottie now, and the fear is overwhelming. She's brought me here so quickly. She could have stalled more in the Twilight Zone. She could have made a few small sacrifices in the Midnight Zone to buy herself more time, but she didn't. She knew that her secrets would be well protected with whatever she had in store for me here, in the Abyss. At this stage, I was completely immersed in her memory. I was merely a passenger, going along for whatever ride she was going to take me on. When I opened my eyes, I was strapped to a table, and Dottie was strapped to the table next to me. I suppose that's fitting. It didn't seem like it would be that different from our defense training. Though I'd never been on the receiving end, I'd taught many lessons. When they started shocking us, I was ready. As ready as anyone can be, anyway. There are only so many ways you can hurt someone without damaging them. I was intimately familiar with all of them. From our experiments on test subjects, we realized that 4 hours of enhanced defense training was what most people could handle. That would help run the clock out on the bathysphere, with the added chance that whoever was diving into your mind would leave early if they couldn't handle the pain. They'd put a clock in the bare concrete room where they did their training. It was the only other thing in the room besides the table Dottie was on, and the small table next to it full of various tools. I could make it 4 hours. In the Abyss, you're almost like a ghost. You get dragged along with the target's memories, and whatever happened to them happens to you right alongside them. Sometimes you see yourself as them, sometimes you're beside them, while everything happening to them is duplicated for you. It's like you're having double vision. When we hit 6 hours, I realized something was very wrong, that perhaps they'd crossed lines we hadn't. The possibility had been discussed, of course. Hit 48 hours and you'd be invincible. Enemy agents wouldn't have time to get to the trenches, get the information they needed, and decompress on the way to the surface. We'd tried it, of course, but the few unlucky test subjects had been entirely useless when we were done. They were beating us when I heard, "Edgar Morris, your time is up. Resurface now or continue the mission. The choice is yours. I can't press my earbud, but that's really only to help ground me anyway. The boys upstairs can see and hear everything. I say through the blood pooling in my mouth, acknowledged. I'm going to the trenches. Whatever secrets Dottie has that would be important enough to warrant protection as drastic as this, meant that time was of the essence. What she had could mean life or death for everyone and everything on the planet. I had to try. The boys upstairs did not radio back. Focus was critical. Knowing I had an end time helped. They wouldn't keep going past 48 hours. There would be no point. I was dead anyway. Every few hours the torturers swapped out. I learned that even I did not know all of the ways you can hurt someone without permanently damaging them. I kept telling myself, world-ending secrets, governments rising and falling, and lives ending in the most gruesome ways. I told myself it might be completely up to me to save the world. I also took a great deal of satisfaction in the fact that I screamed less than Dottie did. When it was over, the room vanished and we descended together. You've entered the Hadal Zone. Your name was Edgar Morris. Thank you for your service. The loop kept playing as Dottie and I acclimated to our descent. I don't know how long it was before I radioed back acknowledged. But time didn't matter anymore. This was the end. It's just us now. No distractions, no more defenses save for the most important one. We're truly tied together here. Dottie's inside my head now, just like I'm inside hers. It's the most intimate bond either of us will ever share. When we come to, we're lying close together, my arm under her back, her hair sprawled out over my chest, like some sick parody of intimacy. Though we're on opposite sides, I respect her dedication. I've always felt more of a camaraderie with my fellow agents than with the people who pull the strings, on either side. I decide we have time to let her say her last words, while I gather the strength to do what needs to be done. Finally, I ask her, "What the fuck do you have that's worth all that?" She replied simply, "I don't know." I lead us into the conversation that we've both certainly had with other people countless times before. How can you side with them, after what they've done? She moves away from me, finding the strength to get up at last. In the Midnight Zone, the man you saw, Luke, she smiles. "You didn't get anything useful there. He's already dead." She starts looking around us, taking in the trench, looking for weapons, but only out of obligation to try. She knows it's over. I loved him. I know we're not supposed to. I feel her anger, her rage now, as if it were my own. That was nothing compared to what your people did to him. I move away from her, sitting up. On my end, the trench is always the same. The scientists or doctors, whatever they are, don't understand exactly what it is yet. But they theorize that the brain takes you somewhere comfortable after it's brought up the worst things it can. It's a sort of recovery. My trench is the creek by my old house, where I spent the first 12 years of my life. That wasn't before the war, but it was before the war found its way to me, before it took away everything. I'd seen bedrooms and living rooms. I'd seen schools and churches and mountains and lakes. I'd seen other forests. But Dottie's trench, her safe space, was the most similar to mine I'd ever seen. It was the same hot tropical forest we'd caught her in, with the addition of a small creek running through it. Hers had ferns and thick grasses on the edge of the water, while mine had a bed of slate jutting out from the pines. Where our memories met in the middle, the snow mixed with loose sand. We felt hot and cold at the same time, and when I sat up, I felt her fear. This was it. I don't know what she felt from me in that moment. I was more tired than anything. "Any last words?" I asked her. "I've already said them to someone else," she said. As we both acclimated, our forests started merging. Snow started falling on the ferns. Bright blossoms sprouted on the pines. Birds and bugs sounded out over the quiet of the pine needles and the snow. Her forest was taking over mine. In the trenches, it came down to size and strength. There were smooth rocks in Dottie's Creek that on a smaller opponent, perhaps, would have been useful. But it wasn't even a fight between us. I towered over her. Now it was just a matter of following protocol. The one thing both of our sides could agree upon was that, in the nuclear age, our war was bigger than us. We had precious few ground rules we followed to make sure that there would be someone left when the war was over. The idea was simple and had been brought about by the generation before us. Anyone willing to possess or extract potentially world-ending secrets should have to get literal blood on their hands. The tradition came from an old idea at the very start of the nuclear age, an idea that was never implemented but might have saved countless lives. The idea was that potentially apocalyptic nuclear codes should be tattooed on the inside of someone's ribcage, and if whoever was in charge wanted to access them, they had to carve open their chest. They had to understand the cost of what they were doing. For decades now, both sides had been sending back bodies with the hearts carved out. It was an honorable death, and it reminded us all what was at stake. It wasn't always possible in the dreamscape. Not everyone had the right tools. But I was lucky, I guess. The slate that jutted out at the edge of my creek came out in big chunks when I needed it. It snapped jagged and rough, and though it might break, I could always snap off another piece to finish the job. Back in the real world, I'd used the slate to scrape off the skin of a soldier who'd done the same to my mother. It was an honorable weapon because it cut me too when I wielded it. As I held Dottie down, she tried to reason with me, to tell me that I didn't know what was at stake, but I didn't listen. Her emotions were taking me over, and I wanted to believe her so badly, but I managed to hold on to what little of myself still remained. I gave Dottie a proper send-off, an agent's death. I considered killing more honorable in the dreamscape because I felt it with her as I carved out her heart. I only had a few minutes after she died, but for those few minutes, we were truly merged. I could see everything. All of her memories, her thoughts, and her feelings were mine. For the first time in my life, I felt the full spectrum of human emotion, and it was glorious and horrible at the same time. I knew what we needed instantly. It was a string of 12 numbers. I radioed in to send it topside, then said, "This is Edgar Morris. It's been an honor." I set Dottie's heart next to me on the forest floor. I watched the creek wash away the blood dripping from her body, but I didn't put my hands in. It was important to remember what was at stake. I wanted the boys upstairs to see it too, for as long as they could. My quiet, cold, lovely forest got louder as more birds and bugs took over. The snow melted and the wind slowed. The sun banished the last of the cold, and I watched plants with glossy leaves grow over the bed of needles. This was her revenge, total decompression sickness. Her body would die now, but her mind was overwriting mine. I wondered how long they'd keep my body alive for. They could send other agents into midnight, with more than enough time to get back. They could find every face she'd ever seen. I tried to hold on to my mother's face, how it had been in life, of course. Not the gruesome sight it had been after her death, but it slipped away, replaced by Dottie's mother. All of the things that had made me myself melted away, and I felt okay with that. I looked at my hands now, and they were almost as gory as they'd been when I'd held Luke's body. The boys topside could see when the end was near, and they radioed down, "Thank you, Edgar Morris. You've done the right thing. God, I hope so." World-ending secrets, governments rising and falling, lives ending in the most gruesome ways. As Dottie's mind erased mine, I picked up her heart and held it to my chest. I know this is the end, but I've trained for it, and I'm ready. As ready as anyone can be anyway. Behind every closed door lies a new fear. Shall we open the next one together? I woke to the sound of knocking at the door of the apartment I shared with my partner. It was a little late for visitors or neighbors to be coming by to borrow something, I mused. I slipped out of bed and exited the room. "1 minute," I called out, my voice still thick with sleep. I made my way to the front door where I was greeted by 2 grim-faced, uniformed police officers. "Mr. Watkins?" The one to my right-hand side asked. "Yes. May I help you?" I asked. Are you married to a... He paused to check the notes on a small pad of paper. Terrence Watkins? He prodded further. I am. What is this about? I countered, already slightly defensive and on edge due to the circumstances. I wondered if my usually mild-mannered husband had gotten in trouble. We're sorry to inform you that your husband has been in an accident. The officer, who had been silent, stepped into the conversation. I felt as if someone had hit me in the chest with a sledgehammer. I couldn't breathe or make a sound, but silent tears streamed from my eyes. The first officer, who had spoke up, caught me when my knees buckled and they entered the house, helping me to a seat in the small living room. I managed to calm down enough to talk again. Is he alive? The question was shaky but clear. He is alive. You don't seem to be in the condition to drive, so we can give you a ride to the hospital if you like, the quieter police officer said. I nodded my head and then hurried back into the bedroom, where I quickly changed my clothes and put on socks and shoes. They escorted me to the cruiser and let me into the back seat. For a moment, I felt as if I were in trouble, that being the first time I had ever been in the back of a police car. When we arrived at the large building, they let me out, following me inside. One of the officers went and talked to the receptionist for me. The men in uniform stayed behind when I walked toward the elevator. The ride up to the intensive care unit seemed to take an hour. When the doors finally rolled open, I stepped out, finding my way to the appropriate room. And when I stepped through the open doorway, I froze. My husband was lying on his back with so many wires, hoses, and tubes snaking away from his body in various directions that I failed to process what I was seeing for a moment. I moved to his bedside and reached out, taking the hand of my partner. I don't know if you can hear me, but I am here, baby, I said. There was no response, not even a squeeze of my fingers. I had hoped that his situation wasn't as bad as it looked. My heart sank when the nurse and doctor entered the room and confirmed all of my worst fears. Terry was in a coma, completely brain dead. How long can we keep him on life support? I remember asking. A few months. There's always hope that he will wake up. The best thing to can do is to be here and talk to him when you can. Tonight, you need to go home and get some rest, the doctor informed me. The nurse even called me a cab, and I tried to sleep, but kept waking every few hours, convinced I had heard my phone ring. There were no notifications when I checked, however. I called my boss the next morning and informed him I wouldn't be in for at least a couple of days. Thankfully, he was sympathetic to my situation and told me to take as much time as I needed. I took a shower and shaved, making myself at least look like I had my shit together before I went to the hospital and sat with my husband. Both of our parents visited, and there was prayer and tears among them. I remember sitting in the chapel with them, but I couldn't bring myself to join the prayers. Days passed in similar fashion. When I was not at work, I was in that room with the man I loved. I was starting to lose hope after almost a month, and finally entered the chapel alone, and I sat in front of the altar, sobbing, finally breaking down in prayer. A few days came and went after that, and then one morning I stepped into the room to find Terry's eyes open. I freaked out, screaming for the doctor. The staff rushed in to see what had stirred me up, and I was quickly ushered out of the room. The doctor joined me in the hallway. Your husband is alert and responsive, but I have to caution you that he was unconscious for a long time, and we have seen cases where things like this can lead to wild personality shifts, he said, using a gentle, professional tone. I nodded, but wasn't really absorbing what the man had said. I was just happy that the other man was awake. Some of my joy was dampened by the fact that he was having trouble remembering words and names of common objects. I was grateful, however, that he seemed to remember me, holding my hand and squeezing it affectionately when it was offered. The initial few weeks after his awakening went by slowly while he learned to walk and eat again. The trouble started in the days after he came home. Terry couldn't sleep. I had similar problems in the hospital, but eventually they would give me something to help me, he confessed during a long conversation. That led to a protracted argument, and I went to bed angry. We didn't really speak for a few days, and one day, about 2 days after the fight, I came home to an empty apartment. I tried not to worry about it, though I looked for a note and didn't find one. I wasn't surprised then when Terry came home in the middle of the night. I was, however, startled to hear another voice. This one female. "Are you sure that he won't wake up?" the strange woman asked just as I had cracked the door. "He sleeps harder than most humans. We will not be discovered," Terry replied. I considered bursting that bubble, but something told me to wait. I did open the door slightly wider, but the woman began to turn in my direction, and I stopped doing everything, including breathing. After a half a minute, I stepped backward. "We should go somewhere else. I know somewhere," the woman said, loud enough for me to hear through the partially cracked door. They did leave shortly after that, and I considered following them but thought better of it. I cried myself back to sleep instead. I wondered if this was what the doctor had tried to warn me about the next morning as I shared a silent meal with the man I had married. I desperately tried to think of something to say, but couldn't. He made no effort to start a conversation either. I swallowed the urge to ask about his visitor the night before, and instead got ready to go to work. When I got home, the apartment was vacant again. My husband had left his clothing and other items, so I assumed he would be home late once again. I did wake when the door opened and closed, but didn't get up this time. Days like this turned to weeks. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I turned on the location sharing on my lover's phone, and I even left work early in order to get extra sleep. I heard Terrence enter the apartment with the strange woman again. They stayed only a short time, and this time when they left, I slipped from my bed and out the door behind them. I used my phone to track them, driving slowly until they stopped in the middle of nowhere. I sped up when I got past the traffic lights and stop signs, only slowing when the GPS prompted me to turn off of the pavement onto a narrow dirt lane. I stopped at the side of this small road as I got near my husband's location and proceeded on foot, afraid of alerting him and his companion to my presence. I had suspected he was cheating on me, but when I rounded the corner, that no longer made sense. The only structure in the area was a large old barn. I glanced around and saw Terry's car parked to a small minivan. I glanced around, but it didn't seem anyone was outside. I hurried toward the building, and as I did, noticed strange flickering lights through the gaps under the doors. I could also hear people chanting inside. I crept to a small door to the left-hand side of the building, the barrier partially cracked, allowing me to peer inside. I didn't see Terry, but I could see the back of his new friend's head. It was bowed as if in prayer. I reached out and gently pried the door open a little further, poking my head inside to see a group of people standing in a circle, a candle at each of their feet. Terry was in the middle, his torso bare, skin smeared and marked with dark ash. He seemed to be leading the chants. I don't know if the cry I felt escaped or I simply gasped, but the woman, who was directly in front of me, spun in a rapid about-face maneuver. I bolted, sprinting back to my car. I went straight home, expecting them to follow behind me. They didn't. I didn't see the man I had married for 2 whole days. When he did return, neither of us mentioned the incident a few nights before. Honestly, I didn't even know if they investigated or knew that I had seen them. I didn't really want to find out. A week later, he moved out, but still hasn't asked for a divorce. That's where we still stand at the moment, separated. I haven't seen Terry in 2 months. I have been trying to mind my own business. I had never violated Terry's privacy before that night, or since. I still don't know what to think about what I saw in that barn. We have talked for the first time in months. Maybe being away from me on Thanksgiving finally gave him a wake-up call, because he called me. When we met, he didn't mention the night I had followed him, so I started to suspect he didn't know it had happened. I wasn't going to be the one to bring it up. I was just happy to have him home, even if it only lasted an hour, and we barely talked. When he left, I checked to see if he had disabled location sharing on his phone. He hadn't. I considered snooping, but managed to restrain myself. I tried to focus on Christmas shopping online, but the urge to pry into my husband's recent activities overwhelmed me. He had been visiting that strange barn at the edge of town a lot lately. I had flashbacks of that night. The strangers surrounding my lover with those candles at their feet, speaking those strange words. I tried to push it out of my mind. Eventually, I managed to focus on my work and tried to return to normal. I was well on my way to that, even though I have started drinking at night to help me sleep and, if I'm honest, cope with the loneliness I have felt over the last few months. I want my husband back, but I don't know how to go about achieving that goal. I called him the other day, but the conversation was brief. One positive is that we were cordial. He's actually starting to act more like himself again. Maybe all of this is his way of processing his time in the coma. I planned to ask him about that the next time we met up, and I finally worked up the nerve to call him for the second time in a week. I arranged for us to meet on Sunday. The next couple of days seemed to crawl and grow progressively more lonely as I eagerly anticipated my opportunity to get some answers. Sunday arrived, and I was chipper as I made a pot of coffee and even a small breakfast for myself. I didn't realize how hungry I was, devouring the waffles quickly. I ventured into the bathroom and quickly noticed that I had also been neglecting my appearance. I shaved and hurried out of the apartment, driving myself downtown to get a haircut as well. I went and visited my mother, who has been supporting me, though I didn't tell her about the strange ritual in the barn. We talked for a long time, and she echoed a sentiment that I recalled from a comment on my original post. It was time to get my husband back, though I didn't know exactly how to go about it. I went home and got ready to meet Terry, changing my clothes. I called my husband to confirm that he still wanted to see me, and he said he did, and even suggested a restaurant that we frequented in the early days of our relationship. That gave me hope, and I was actually smiling when I got into the car, already planning on things to say. My spirits died when I saw Terry waiting for me at the doors to the building with an official-looking envelope. "Don't open this until we get inside, please," he said, and I felt my face fall into a frown. "What's going on, Terrence?" I asked. But he didn't answer. He simply turned and walked inside the building, and I followed. We were seated quickly, which I found odd, and the server seemed to linger at our table even though we had already ordered our drinks. Eventually, the young man walked away, and my husband looked at me with a semi-glazed look in his eyes. I opened the envelope. When I saw the header of the papers, my heart stopped. Divorce? The word felt heavy, and my lips and tongue felt numb as I spoke it. "Yes," he replied with no emotion, though the question had been rhetorical. I shook my head and tucked the papers away before the young man brought my soda and his water. Anger and sadness were at war inside me. I wanted to confront him about how much he had changed since the car accident. Instead, I broke down in tears. I stood and excused myself. I didn't feel stable enough to drive home, so I called my mother, who was more than happy to come and pick me up. "It went that badly, huh?" she asked me, trying to be sympathetic. "He wants a divorce," I explained. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," she said, reaching over to pat the back of my hand before returning her grip to the wheel. I didn't reply, simply stared out of the window until we arrived at my home. When I got inside, I placed the paperwork on the dining room table, sitting down to start reading through the packet. His reason for the divorce was irreconcilable differences, but had offered no explanation in the space provided. For a moment, I wondered if he had somehow changed his sexuality after awakening from the coma. I gave myself a few days to process things and called him last Wednesday. Once again, he was cordial with me, almost as if he weren't breaking my heart. It was that night that I decided I would do something drastic. If he went out to that barn, I would go there as well and confront him. I checked his location obsessively that night, but he stayed in town. It was Friday before he visited the barn, but true to my silent promise, I got dressed in all black clothing and drove out of town. I parked on the side of the narrow dirt road again, glancing around as I pulled the hood over my head. the chill immediately biting my ears. My breath hung in the air as I crept forward. I looked around, but again saw nobody outside the building. I could again see the flickering light. I hurried toward the barn, feeling emboldened suddenly. I was going to get my answers at the very least. I didn't care what any of the strangers said. Those thoughts died in my brain when I tried to open the door I had peeked through before. It was shut, and there was no give to it at all. That meant that someone had known about my visit after all. I could hear Terry's voice through the wall, once again leading that foreign chant. I looked around again, feeling as if I were being watched. I saw no one as I looked over by the minivan and other car parked in the small lot again, but the feeling persisted. I stepped away from the door and started around toward the front of the building. I heard a scrabbling sound from the roof of the barn, which caused my head to jerk in that direction. The first thing I noticed were a pair of glowing deep purple eyes in the darkness above my head. I couldn't make out the form of the thing initially as it kind of blended into the gloom around it. It moved, and I took it in. The thing was bipedal, but I would not call it humanoid. It was like a twisted, undulating mass of darkness, except for the eyes. A cry rose from my throat before I could slam my mouth closed, and the thing on the roof reacted, leaping toward me. I started running before it landed on the ground and didn't look back until I reached my car. It hadn't chased me. I sat behind the wheel and waited to see the thing coming at me. I didn't. I also didn't leave as I was planning to do as I sprinted down the dirt road. Instead, I turned the key and drove toward the barn, turning my headlights on, hitting the lever that turned on the brighter bulbs. I rounded the corner, but there was nothing there but the barn. I wondered if I had imagined the thing, but the fact that the area was vacant also galvanized me. I accelerated until I got closer to the barn, the palm of my hand pressing into the horn, laying on it. The prolonged beeping sound seemed to drown out everything, and when I braked, I shifted the car into park, and my foot pressed the accelerator to the floor. The impromptu plan to disrupt whatever they were doing worked. The barn doors opened, and there was a group of angry people illuminated by the lights on the car. One of them, the woman who had been at my apartment, began to grin. She stepped forward and raised her left arm, 2 fingers of that hand directed at my car. There was a thud on the roof, and I heard a low rumbling noise above me. The sound seemed to resonate in my very core, turning my guts and spine into jelly in an instant. I slammed the car into reverse and pressed the gas again. The wheels spun for a half a second before it started moving backward. The thing on the roof hung on somehow, and I started to panic. I slammed on the brakes as hard as I could. That threw the thing in front of my car, and I got a good look at it for the first time. Its flesh was as dark as I had thought, and pulsing with odd cyst-like knobs that seemed to have minds of their own. The worst part was that twisted face, no nose or ears, just a knobby mass with a split that revealed rotted-looking, sharp teeth. I screamed again and started to reverse again. I turned my car around as the creature rushed toward me. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I rounded the corner and punched the gas pedal again, the thing with the glowing eyes gaining ground on me, even as I sped up. It stopped when I reached the main road, and I breathed a sigh of relief even though I was still terrified. I drove the rest of the way home and tried to reason through the night's events. I have spent the past 5 days or so going down internet rabbit holes, trying to figure out what the thing I saw was, but have had no luck. Another recurring question I have is this: what happened to my husband while he was comatose? And who are these strangers he is meeting with? I don't know about going back to the barn, with that beast guarding them. I signed the divorce papers and am going to call my soon-to-be ex-husband. Maybe I will confront him on the phone. Subscribe for next part. The abyss of terror is deep. Let's descend further into the next harrowing story. My name is Emmett, and this is the story I never thought I'd have to tell. If you're listening, you might not believe me, and that's fine. I wouldn't believe me either. It all started when my sister, Ruth, and I inherited a house from our Uncle Silas. The news came out of nowhere. We hadn't heard from Uncle Silas in years, but when he passed, his lawyer sent us a letter saying we were his only family left. The house sat on the edge of a little village we'd never heard of, surrounded by thick, swampy forests. When we got there, I knew right away something wasn't right. The village was empty, or maybe it just felt that way. The houses were old and gray, the streets cracked, and the air had a heavy stillness to it, like the whole place was holding its breath. As we parked the car and unloaded our bags, we noticed a group of villagers standing at a distance, staring. Not saying the house was worse than I expected. It was big, but it looked like it was falling apart. The wood creaked under our feet, and the smell of dust mixed with something damp. The windows were covered with thick, heavy curtains. It felt like no one had opened them in years. "This place gives me the creeps," Ruth said, dropping her bag in the hallway. I didn't argue. She was right. We spent the rest of the day cleaning up and unpacking. The rooms were dark, even during the day, and it felt like the house was watching us. Every now and then I'd catch Ruth looking out the window like she was searching for something. But when I asked, she just shrugged. Late in the afternoon, an old man from the village came to the door. His name was Mr. Hodges. He was thin, with sunken cheeks and a voice that cracked when he spoke. He looked nervous, like he didn't want to be here. "You'll be fine," he said, his eyes darting toward the swamp in the distance. "But you mustn't open the windows at night, no matter what you hear." "What are we going to hear?" Ruth asked, her tone half joking. Mr. Hodges didn't smile. "You'll hear the whistle. Everyone does, but don't answer it. Don't look for it. Lock your doors and keep the curtains shut. And don't." He stopped suddenly, as if he'd said too much already. I tried to get him to explain, but he just shook his head, muttering something under his breath before leaving. When night came, the air grew colder. The forest outside seemed to come alive, the trees swaying and groaning as if whispering secrets. Ruth and I lit some candles and sat in the small living room. The lights didn't work, so the only thing keeping the darkness away was the soft flicker of the flames. "I don't get it," Ruth said, hugging her knees. "Why would Uncle Silas live here? Why would anyone?" I didn't have an answer. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. And then we heard it. At first, it was faint, like the sound of a bird in the distance, a long, shrill whistle drifting through the fog. It started soft, almost easy to ignore, but then it grew louder, clearer. It sounded close, like it was coming from just beyond the house. Ruth stood up, her head tilting slightly as if she was listening closely. "Do you hear that?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice low. "It's just the wind, Ruth. Sit down." But she didn't sit down. She moved closer to the window, her fingers brushing the edge of the curtain. "Ruth," I snapped, louder this time. "Don't. Remember what that old guy said?" She blinked, as if shaking herself out of a daze. "I know. It's just weird." We sat in silence for what felt like hours, but it must have only been a few minutes. The whistle continued soft, high and slow, like it was calling out to someone. I locked every door, checked every window, and made sure the curtains were closed tight. Ruth watched me the whole time. She looked different, quieter than usual, like something was on her mind. That night I barely slept. I lay in bed, listening to the whistle drift through the fog, feeling like something or someone was waiting just outside. I don't know when I fell asleep that night, but when I woke up, the house felt wrong. The air was colder than before, and everything was silent. Not the normal kind of silence either. It was heavy, like even the walls were holding their breath. I glanced at the clock by my bed, 3:12 a.m. That's when I noticed something else. The faint sound of the whistle was still drifting through the air. It was louder now, clearer, and it sent a chill up my spine. Then I realized Ruth's bed was empty. "Ruth?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Nothing." I climbed out of bed, my feet hitting the icy floor. The house was pitch dark except for the pale gray light sneaking through a crack in the curtains. I opened her bedroom door wider. "Ruth?" Still nothing. I felt the fear build in my chest as I moved through the house. My footsteps creaked on the old wood floors, the sound far too loud in the dead silence. I checked the living room. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. Then I saw it. The front door was open just a crack. A cold breeze slipped through the gap, and with it came the whistle, soft and slow, like it was calling for someone. "No, no, no," I whispered, hurrying to the door. I flung it open and froze. Outside, the fog was so thick I could barely see a foot in front of me. It wasn't normal fog either. It clung to everything like sticky smoke, swirling and moving in strange patterns. And there, in the middle of it, was Ruth. She was standing at the edge of the porch, facing the fog. She didn't move. She didn't say a word. Her arms hung loosely at her sides, and her head was tilted slightly, like she was listening to something only she could hear. "Ruth," I called out. My voice sounded small against the heavy air. "What are you doing? Come inside." She didn't react. It was like she couldn't hear me at all. I stepped onto the porch, and my heart dropped. That's when I saw Ita's figure in the fog. At first, it was just a shape. Tall and thin, moving slowly, almost gliding through the mist. But as it got closer, I could make out more details. Its arms were long, too long, and its fingers hung down like sharp, crooked twigs. Its face was pale, almost white, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to swallow the darkness around them. And it was whistling. The sound didn't come from its mouth. Its lips never moved. The whistle just existed, echoing through the fog like it was part of the air itself. "Ruth!" I shouted again, louder this time. I took a step toward her, but the second I did, her head snapped around to face me. Her eyes were wide and blank, and her lips moved slightly, like she was whispering something. "Ruth," I said, my voice breaking. "Please, come inside." The figure loomed closer behind her, its long arms stretching out, its fingers reaching toward her shoulders. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran toward her. My feet hit the muddy ground, and the cold fog wrapped around me like ice. "Ruth!" I grabbed her wrist. Her skin was freezing. For a moment, she didn't move. She just stared past me into the fog, her lips still whispering. Then, the whistle grew louder, deafening. The whistle grew so loud it felt like it was inside my head, rattling my bones. I pulled harder on Ruth's wrist, desperate to get her away from the fog. "Ruth, please," I shouted. "Come with me." For the first time, she turned to look at me, really look at me. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her lips were trembling. "Can't you hear it?" she whispered. "It's beautiful." "It's not," I yelled back. "Ruth, listen to me. We have to go." That's when I saw it, the creature. It stepped closer, its long, bony limbs moving unnaturally, like its joints didn't bend the right way. The fog seemed to follow it, swirling around its legs as it glided forward. Its face was worse up close, completely smooth except for those deep, hollow eyes. Eyes that seemed to pull me in the longer I looked. And it kept whistling. The sound wasn't like a tune anymore. It was more like a hum that scraped against my ears and burrowed into my mind. I felt dizzy, like my body was sinking into the ground. I couldn't move. My grip on Ruth's wrist weakened, and for a second, I thought I was going to fall. The creature stopped just behind Ruth. Its long, spindly fingers hovered over her shoulders, so close they could touch her. And still, she didn't move. She just stared blankly at me, like she was already gone. "Ruth," I choked out, forcing myself to move. I grabbed her other arm, shaking her hard. "Snap out of it. We have to get inside." Her lips moved again, whispering words I couldn't hear. Then her eyes darted past me, back to the creature, and her face twisted with something, fear maybe, or pain, but it was too late. The creature's fingers curled around Ruth's shoulders, and everything happened at once. Her body went stiff, her head tilted back so far it looked wrong. I screamed her name as I tried to pull her away, but she wouldn't budge. And then crack. The sound of her neck snapping echoed through the air, sharp and awful, cutting through the whistle. For a moment, everything froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Ruth's body dropped to the ground, limp, and the fog swallowed her whole. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "No, no, no." The creature's head tilted slightly, as if it were looking at me. I couldn't see its eyes anymore, but I felt its stare. My legs wouldn't work. My body felt heavy, like the fog was pressing down on me. The whistle started again, louder this time, ringing in my ears. I clamped my hands over my head, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The sound wrapped around me, squeezing me, pulling me down. I don't remember much after that. I think I screamed. I think I tried to run, but the fog was too thick, and the whistle was too loud. The last thing I remember was the creature stepping closer, its long arms reaching out, and the world going black. When I woke up, the world was silent. The fog was gone, and the sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in pale orange and gray. I was lying on the porch, my clothes soaked with mud, my hands freezing and shaking. "Ruth?" I croaked. My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. I sat up slowly, my whole body aching. The ground was empty. There was no sign of her. Just the still, cold air and the empty trees beyond the house. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ruth!" I shouted this time. My voice echoed through the trees, but no one answered. The house was quiet, the village in the distance empty as ever. It felt like the entire world had disappeared, leaving me behind. I ran down the steps and into the muddy yard, looking for anything that could tell me she was still there. But there was nothing. No footprints, no trail. It was like the fog had swallowed her whole, leaving me alone. The only thing I found were my own muddy footprints on the porch, leading to where I had collapsed. "Please," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "Ruth." I sat down on the steps, my head in my hands. I didn't know how long I stayed there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. The village never stirred. The swamp was silent. By the time I forced myself to stand, the sun was higher in the sky, and the whistle, it was gone. I kept expecting to hear it again, faint and distant, but the air stayed quiet. When I finally went back inside the house, everything looked the same as it had the day before. The heavy curtains, the dust, the broken furniture. But now it felt even emptier-like. Something important was missing. I stayed in the house one more night, though I don't know why. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the living room, listening to the silence and staring at the door, waiting for the whistle, waiting for Ruth to come back. But she never did. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't look back at the house as I drove away. I didn't stop to talk to the villagers or ask questions. I didn't want answers anymore. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Days later, I went to the police, but they didn't believe me. They searched the house, the swamp, and the village, but they didn't find Ruth. They didn't find anything. As far as they were concerned, she just disappeared. But I know the truth. Sometimes at night, when I'm lying in bed and everything is quiet, I think I hear that faint, slow whistle drifting through the dark. It's never loud, never clear, but I know it's there. I'll never forget that sound. And no matter where I go, I never open the windows at night, because I know it's still out there. If you thought that was unsettling, just wait until you hear what comes next. The wind hit us hard as we stepped out of the van. The sea roared below, crashing into the cliffs like it wanted to pull the whole church down with it. Blackwater Church stood there, silent and broken, its spire leaning like it might collapse at any second. I'm Margaret, an archaeologist, or at least I try to be. My team, just 3 of us, had come to this cliffside ruin to document its history before the government declared it unsafe. It was my idea. But as I stood there staring at the crumbling walls, I felt a knot in my stomach. "This place gives me the creeps," Daryl muttered, pulling his jacket tighter. He was the youngest of the group, more of a helper than a historian, but he had a knack for noticing things. "It's just an old church," I said, trying to sound confident. But deep down, I felt a tooth heaviness in the air, like the place was watching us. We hauled our equipment inside, the doors creaking loudly as we pushed them open. The inside was worse than I expected. The stone walls were covered in strange carvings, almost like drawings of skeletons, their bony hands reaching out for something or someone. "Who carves this stuff in a church?" Anna, the third member of our team, asked. She was always the logical one, never scared by things like this. "Maybe it's old art," I suggested, though even I didn't believe that. The carvings were too detailed, too strange. We set up our gear in the main hall. Sunlight barely reached inside, and the air smelled damp and salty, mixed with something elsey faint, sour odor I couldn't place. As I unpacked, my eyes kept drifting to the altar. It was cracked and stained, and there were more carvings on it. "Is it just me, or are those skeletons different?" Daryl asked, pointing. He was right. The skeletons on the altar looked more human than the ones on the walls. Their hollow eyes seemed to stare back at us, almost alive. I brushed it off. "Let's get to work. The sooner we finish, the sooner we can leave." But as the sun dipped lower and the shadows crept across the stone floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The first day passed quietly, but the silence felt heavy. The church didn't just feel old, it felt wrong. The carvings on the walls seemed darker in the fading light, their twisted shapes shifting with every flicker of our flashlights. By the time we stopped for the night, the wind outside had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the stone walls. We set up our sleeping bags in what used to be the main hall, right in front of the altar. It wasn't exactly cozy, but it was better than being outside where the wind could knock you off the cliffs. "I'll take first watch," Anna offered. She wasn't just the logical one, she was practical too, always prepared. Daryl and I lay down while Anna sat by the door with her flashlight. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to block out the cold, but sleep wouldn't come. The church was too quiet now, like the wind didn't dare come inside. And then, at midnight, I heard it. A single, low toll of a bell. It was distant but clear, cutting through the silence like a knife. My eyes shot open, and I sat up so fast I nearly knocked over my bag. "Did you hear that?" Daryl whispered, his face pale in the dim light. Anna was already on her feet, her flashlight aimed at the ceiling. "That wasn't real," she said quickly. "The bell tower collapsed years ago. There's no bell up there anymore." But then it rang again, louder this time. The sound seemed to echo around us, filling every corner of the church. Daryl grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the altar. His hand was shaking. "What if someone's out there?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. Anna walked toward the door, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "I'm going to check outside," she said. "Are you crazy?" Daryl hissed. "What if it's not someone?" Anna ignored him and opened the door just enough to peek outside. The wind howled as she leaned out, her flashlight beam sweeping over the empty cliffs. She shut the door quickly and turned back to us. "There's nothing there," she said firmly, but her voice wavered just enough to give her away. We all stayed awake after that, sitting in a tight circle in the middle of the hall. The bells didn't ring again, but the silence was worse somehow. It pressed down on us, making it hard to breathe. Around 3 a.m., Daryl stood up suddenly. "I need some air," he said, heading for the door before we could stop him. "Wait," I called, but he was already outside. We followed him to the edge of the cliffs, where the moonlit sea churned far below. "Daryl, get back here," Anna said sharply. He didn't answer. The bell tolled again, louder than ever, and Daryl froze. His flashlight fell from his hand, tumbling down the rocks. He turned to us, his face twisted in fear. "They're coming," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, he screamed a raw, awful sound that made my blood run cold. He stumbled backward, his hands clawing at the air, and then he was gone. We rushed to the edge, but there was nothing there, just the waves crashing against the rocks below. "Daryl!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. Anna grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the church. "We can't stay out here," she said, her voice shaking. We slammed the door behind us, locking out the wind and the sea, but the silence inside was worse than ever. The bell tolled one last time, and this time it sounded like it was coming from inside the church. Anna and I barely spoke after Daryl vanished. What could we say? We both knew he wasn't coming back, but we didn't want to admit it. We sat in silence, huddled together in the dark, jumping at every creak of the church. I couldn't shake the sound of his scream. It echoed in my head, over and over, blending with the memory of that final bell. "Do you think he fell?" Anna whispered, breaking the silence. I didn't answer. I didn't know. Instead, I focused on the altar. Something about it drew my attention, like it wanted me to look closer. The carvings on its surface weren't just random skeletons, they were detailed, too detailed. And there, right in the middle, were fresh marks. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked toward the altar. "Margaret, what are you doing?" Anna hissed. But I didn't stop. The carvings seemed deeper now, like the stone had been cut recently. I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling the cold, jagged edges. That's when I noticed Ita's small compartment near the base of the altar. It was barely visible, a thin line in the stone. I pushed against it, and the panel shifted with a low, grating sound. Inside was a small leather book, its cover cracked and faded with age. I opened it carefully, the pages brittle under my fingers. The handwriting was old, looping and hard to read, but I could make out enough to understand. It wasn't a normal journal, it was more like a confession. The writer was the church's last priest, and his words sent chills down my spine. He wrote about how the bells of Blackwater didn't just call people to prayer, they called them to judgment. The priest believed the church was cursed. He said the bells rang for the living to claim them for the dead. Anyone who heard them was marked, and the shadows she called them, the Watchers, would come to collect. As I read, my hands started to shake. The priest described seeing the Watchers pour out of the walls, their black, shapeless forms dragging people into the ground. He wrote about how he tried to destroy the bell tower to stop the curse, but it didn't work. The bells still rang, and the Watchers still came. "What does it say?" Anna asked, her voice tense. I handed her the book, unable to speak. As she read, her face turned pale. "This is insane," she said finally, slamming the book shut. "It's just some old superstition." But even as she said it, I could see the fear in her eyes. The wind howled outside, rattling the doors, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else, a faint whisper, like voices just out of reach. Anna threw the book down and stood up. "We need to leave, now." I didn't argue. We grabbed our bags, moving quickly, the need to escape outweighing everything else. But as we reached the door, the bell tolled again, and this time, the sound was deafening. The bell's toll felt like it was vibrating through my chest, louder than anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, pulling at us, shaking the very walls of the church. Anna grabbed my arm. "We have to go, Margaret, now." I didn't need convincing. We shoved the doors open and stumbled out into the cold night. The wind was fierce, whipping our hair and clothes as we made our way toward the van. But then we heard it, a low, scraping sound, like stone dragging against stone. We froze, turning back toward the church. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but no, it was real. The carvings on the church walls were moving. The skeletal figures stretched and twisted, their bony arms reaching out of the stone. "Run!" Anna screamed, and we bolted. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet, like the cliffs were shifting with every step. I risked a glance back and saw them, the Watchers. They were pouring out of the church walls, dark, shadowy figures that didn't look fully solid. They didn't walk. They glided, their forms shifting like smoke as they came for us. The van was in sight. Just a few more steps. But the bell tolled again, and this time it felt like the air itself was being sucked away. I couldn't breathe. Anna tripped beside me, falling hard onto the rocky ground. "Get up," I yelled, grabbing her arm, but her eyes were wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I looked back and saw them closing in. The watchers moved silently, their hollow faces fixed on us. One of them reached for Anna, its hander what looked like a hand stretching out like a shadow on the ground. She screamed as it touched her, and then she was gone. Just like that. One moment she was there, and the next, she was sinking into the ground, her scream cutting off like someone had flipped a switch. "Anna!" I screamed, reaching for her, but there was nothing to grab, just cold, empty air. I staggered back, tears streaming down my face, and turned toward the van. I didn't stop running. I didn't look back. The bell tolled again as I reached the van, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored it, the tires skidding on the dirt road. As I drove away, I saw the church in my rearview mirror. The watchers stood at the edge of the cliff, their dark forms blending into the night. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. But the bells, they kept ringing. The road back felt endless, the van shaking on the uneven dirt path. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, but I didn't dare let go. The sound of the bells echoed in my head, even though they were far behind now. By the time I reached the main road, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The cliffs were hidden by the distance and the early morning fog, but the memory of the church lingered like a bad dream. I pulled over and got out of the van, needing air, needing to think. My knees buckled as I stepped onto the gravel, and I sank to the ground, trembling. Anna was gone. Daryl was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, the rising sun doing little to warm me. I kept expecting to hear the toll of the bell again, or see the watchers in the shadows of the trees, but there was nothing, just silence. Eventually, I forced myself to drive into town. The local police listened as I tried to explain what happened, but my story sounded ridiculous even to me. A church with no bell ringing on its own. Shadows that came alive. People disappearing into thin air. The officer taking my statement looked at me with pity, like I was some grieving woman who had lost her grip on reality. "The cliffs are dangerous," he said gently. "Your team members probably fell. The tides can carry bodies away quickly out there." I wanted to argue, but what could I say? That shadow monsters dragged them into the ground? That the church itself seemed alive? They sent a search party to the cliffs later that day. They didn't find anything, not even footprints near the edge. The church, they said, looked the same as it always had. But I knew better. I drove back to the city that night, leaving Blackwater and its cursed church behind. But I couldn't leave the memories. Every time I close my eyes, I see Anna's face, hear Daryl's scream. And sometimes, when the world is quiet and still, I think I hear the faint toll of a bell, far off in the distance. A week later, I couldn't help myself. I searched for more information about Blackwater Church, old records, folklore, anything to make sense of what I'd seen. That's when I found it. A picture of the church's altar, taken decades ago by a historian. The carvings were their skeletons and shadowy figurespot in the photo. The names of the lost weren't etched into the stone. Now they are. Anna's name, Daryl's name, and mine. The chills you felt were only the beginning. The next story will leave you breathless.